In the year 98 CE, a Roman senator named Tacitus sat in his study and attempted to describe a people he had never ruled but deeply feared. He called them the Saxons only indirectly, grouping them among the sea raiders of the northern Germanic world who lived beyond the Rhine and the imperial map. At that moment, along the flat marshlands between the lower Elbe and the North Sea, small tribal communities were already shaping a society that would, within a millennium, redefine the political and linguistic foundation of England and Northern Europe. Their villages left little stone, their leaders built no classical monuments, and their laws were carved into memory rather than marble. Yet from these wetlands emerged one of the most enduring cultural lineages of early medieval Europe. By 410 CE, Roman Britain stood abandoned. By 450 CE, Germanic warbands had begun permanent settlement. By 1066 CE, the last Anglo-Saxon king lay dead on a battlefield at Hastings. The transformation from obscure coastal tribes to architects of a medieval civilization unfolded over nearly 15 centuries, driven by migration, warfare, law, and language. The history of the Saxons matters because it explains how tribal Europe became medieval Europe and how local identities became enduring nations. Continue as we examine how river, migration, and power shaped the Saxon world from prehistory to conquest. The environmental stage on which the Saxons would later emerge was shaped long before the name itself existed. Around 10,000 BCE, at the end of the last ice age, retreating glaciers released vast meltwaters into what would become the North Sea basin. Rising sea levels submerged former tundra plains and gradually formed the tidal marshlands of the lower Elbe and Weser rivers. Stratigraphic cores taken from coastal sediment layers between modern Bremerhaven and Hamburg confirm that by 7000 BCE, saltwater intrusion had stabilized the shoreline into a shifting network of mudflats, estuaries, and reed-filled wetlands. These unstable margins forced early human groups into seasonal mobility rather than permanent settlement. Archaeological scatters of flint blades and scrapers, dated by radiocarbon analysis to approximately 8,500–7,500 BCE, indicate small Mesolithic bands exploiting both riverine fish stocks and terrestrial game. The sound of water moving through braided channels defined daily survival. The landscape offered abundance, but no permanence. By 4300 BCE, a fundamental transformation unfolded as Neolithic farming societies began to enter northern Germany from the Danubian corridor. Evidence from funnel beaker culture sites west of the Elbe shows the introduction of grain cultivation, cattle domestication, and permanent timber longhouses. Pollen analysis from peat bogs registers a sharp decline in forest species such as lime and elm between 4200–3800 BCE, indicating systematic land clearance. This agricultural expansion did not erase earlier populations. Instead, isotopic data from human remains at burial sites suggest a gradual genetic and cultural fusion between indigenous foragers and incoming farmers. The wetland margins remained marginal zones, unsuitable for intensive agriculture but ideal for animal grazing and seasonal exploitation. These peripheral spaces would later prove critical for maritime orientation. Between 1800 and 1200 BCE, during the Nordic Bronze Age, material culture in the region underwent a pronounced shift toward long-distance exchange networks. Burial mounds along the Geest uplands contain bronze swords, spiral arm rings, and razors whose raw copper originated in the Alpine zone, traced through lead isotope analysis. Amber from the Baltic coast appears in Mycenaean Grave in Greece during the same period, indicating the integration of northern Europe into Mediterranean trade circuits nearly a millennium before classical history begins. Yet settlement density in the marshlands remained low. Wooden trackways dated to around 1400 BCE, preserved under anaerobic peat conditions, show deliberate engineering to traverse waterlogged terrain. Human movement increasingly followed controlled corridors rather than open wandering. The transition to the early Iron Age after 800 BCE introduced new forms of social differentiation. The local availability of bog iron revolutionized tool and weapon production. Excavations at sites near modern-day Stade reveal shallow pit furnaces capable of producing small iron blooms by 700–600 BCE. Iron sickles replaced bronze implements in agricultural contexts, increasing productivity and allowing marginal soils to be worked more effectively. Funerary evidence reflects widening social hierarchies. While earlier Bronze Age mounds emphasized communal lineage, Iron Age burials increasingly differentiate elite grave with weaponry and imported goods. The distribution of such grave clusters along river routes rather than open plains, emphasizing the centrality of transportation corridors to emerging political authority. By approximately 500 BCE, linguistic differentiation within the Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family had begun to stabilize. Comparative reconstruction places the emergence of Proto-West Germanic along the North Sea coast during this period. While no written records survive from these centuries, hydronyms preserved in later Latin and medieval sources exhibit consistent phonological patterns indicating long-term occupation by related speech communities. This continuity suggests that the ancestors of later Saxon-speaking populations were not intrusive newcomers of the Roman era, but the product of gradual internal development rooted in the Iron Age landscape. Material culture supports this slow consolidation. Pottery assemblages from settlements dated 600–300 BCE display standardized forms characterized by sharply carinated profiles and tempered clay fabrics adapted to low-temperature firing in open hearths. Storage pits at these sites contain carbonized barley and emmer wheat, confirming mixed farming economies. Zooarchaeological remains indicate reliance on cattle for both traction and dairy production, complemented by sheep and pigs. River fishing maintained dietary importance. The rhythm of life followed seasonal cycles tied to floodplain behavior. When winter ice sealed the marsh channels, communities retreated to slightly elevated sand ridges. When spring floods returned, herds were moved again. Meanwhile, the broader European world entered a phase of intensified interaction. By the 4th century BCE, Mediterranean writers such as Pythias of Massalia reached the North Sea and reported on northern trade in amber, though without precise ethnographic distinction. Archaeological evidence supports increased contact. Greek coins dated to the 3rd century BCE have been recovered from contexts along the lower Elbe, indicating intermediary trade. These external linkages did not yet crystallize into political identities recognizable to historians. Power remained localized, expressed through kin networks rather than territorial states. Authority derived from control over pasture, river crossings, and ritual sites rather than fixed borders. A subtle ideological framework accompanied this economic order. Sacred groves and watery deposition sites appear across northern Germany during the late Iron Age. Weapon offerings recovered from riverbeds and peat bogs, dated between 400–100 BCE by typology and organic residue analysis, suggest ritualized relationships between war, fertility, and the natural environment. These practices did not represent organized religion in the later institutional sense, but they structured collective memory and social obligation. Human meaning remained embedded in landscape. Law was unwritten, enforced through repetition and reputation rather than codified decree. By 100 BCE, population densities along the North Sea littoral increased measurably. House plans expand in size. Storage capacity grows. Defensive earthworks appear sporadically on elevated ridges. Archaeological surveys indicate both demographic growth and rising intergroup competition. Climatic reconstructions based on dendrochronology reveal a period of relative warming in the 1st century BCE, improving crop yields, but also intensifying pressure on arable land. These environmental and economic preconditions set the structural foundations for the historical transformations to come. The societies that would later be called Saxon already possessed the ecological knowledge, maritime orientation, and social flexibility necessary to exploit both river and sea. Their world remained unwritten, but it was no longer isolated. The final centuries before the Common Era witnessed subtle but irreversible shifts in the political geometry of the North Sea world. By the 1st century BCE, transregional trade intensifies across the Elbe corridor. Amphora fragments of Roman Republican origin, dated between 100 and 2030 BCE, appear in small quantities at riverine sites inland from the coast, signaling indirect contact with the expanding Mediterranean economy. At the same time, coin hoards buried during this period reveal economic volatility rather than prosperity. The concentration of silver denarii in isolated deposits rather than habitation layers suggests circulation through gift exchange, tribute, or raiding economies rather than market systems. Wealth moved through people, not institutions. Settlement morphology reflects this transition. Excavations near modern Oldenburg show loosely clustered longhouse compounds aligned along creek systems rather than nucleated villages. Each compound functioned as a semi-autonomous economic unit tied to extended kin groups. Hearth debris, loom weights, and spindle whorls establish household-based textile production, while storage ceramics indicate limited surplus accumulation. Authority remained personal and temporary, bound to the ability to attract followers rather than command territory. The political unit was the warband, not the state. Such structures favored mobility, and with mobility came both trade and conflict. Meanwhile, material signs of seaborne orientation become archaeologically visible. Boat rivets and plank fragments preserved in anaerobic sediments along the Jade and Ems estuaries, dated by dendrochronology to between 80–20 BCE, document the emergence of clinker-built vessels capable of open-water navigation. These craft did not yet match the scale of later Saxon or Viking ships, but they expanded the operational range of coastal communities well beyond inland river systems. The soundscape of production likely shifted during this period. Hammer strikes on iron blooms, the creak of drying timber, and the constant movement of water through tidal channels formed an acoustic environment tuned increasingly toward maritime activity. At the same time, Roman political gravity reshaped northern Europe from a distance. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul between 58–50 BCE stabilized the Rhine as an imperial frontier. This sudden militarized boundary redirected trade routes northward and compressed intermediate tribal zones. Although direct Roman presence did not extend into the Saxon heartland at this stage, its structural influence was immediate. Tributary goods flowed toward frontier markets. Tribal polities near the river reorganized around access to Roman materials, especially metal goods and prestige weapons. Stratigraphic layers at sites in Lower Saxony, dated to the late 1st century BCE, show an uptick in imported iron relative to local smelting, reflecting incorporation into frontier exchange systems. Demographic pressure increased accordingly. Radiocarbon-dated burial populations from cemetery clusters along the Middle Elbe reveal steady population growth from 150 BCE to 50 CE. Infant mortality remains high, but adult life expectancy extends slightly due to improved nutritional stability. Stable isotope analysis of bone collagen indicates a diet increasingly weighted toward cultivated grains rather than wild protein, marking full agricultural commitment. These developments did not produce urbanization. Instead, they reinforced dispersed rural settlement patterns optimized for mixed subsistence and rapid relocation if necessary. By the turn of the era, around 1 CE, the cultural matrix that would later crystallize into identifiable Saxon identity was already formed in structure if not in name. The people of this zone were bilingual in land and water, competent in cultivation and navigation, oriented toward kin-based authority, and integrated into long-distance networks without institutional dependence on them. Their social memory was carried through oral genealogies rather than archives. Their law functioned through repeated precedent rather than fixed code. Their political horizon extended to the limits of personal loyalty rather than territorial boundary. This prehistory explains why later Roman observers struggled to classify northern peoples into stable ethnographic categories. The groups were fluid because the economic world required flexibility. Seasonal shifts in water levels could alter settlement viability within a generation. Trade routes migrated with political frontiers. Warfare followed opportunity rather than ideology. Identity responded accordingly. What endured was not a named people, but a structural mode of life adapted to unstable margins between land and sea. By the early 1st century CE, Rome's gaze would finally turn directly toward these coastal societies. When written history begins to illuminate the region, it does not encounter a primitive wilderness, but an ancient human system already shaped by 10 millennia of environmental negotiation and 3,000 years of agricultural culture. The Saxons, when they appear by name, will emerge not from an empty stage, but from this densely layered past. By the mid-1st century CE, the northern frontier of the Roman world stabilized along the Rhine, and with that stabilization came the first sustained written attention to the peoples beyond it. Although the Saxons would not yet be named explicitly, the ethnographic framework within which they would later be identified was taking shape. In 98 CE, Tacitus composed Germania, drawing on military intelligence reports and frontier observations compiled over several decades. His account describes decentralized societies organized around kinship, warrior retinues, and seasonal agriculture, lacking urban centers or monumental architecture. Archaeological correlation supports this depiction. Settlement layers dated between 5100 CE across Lower Saxony continue to show dispersed habitation, light timber construction, and limited storage capacity. There is no material evidence for centralized authority at this stage. Power remained personal, mobile, and contingent. Roman military pressure along the Rhine indirectly reorganized the interior. Between 15 BCE and 9 CE, Augustus, campaigns under Drusus, and later Tiberius pushed deep into Germania before the catastrophic defeat of Varus in 9 CE forced permanent withdrawal to the river Line. Although these operations did not reach the North Sea marshlands directly, they displaced populations throughout the interior. Archaeological gaps in settlement continuity along the Middle Weser, dated to the early 1st century CE, suggest forced migration rather than natural decline. Groups shifted northward and westward, increasing population density in the coastal zone. This demographic compression intensified competition for grazing land and river access. It also accelerated the formation of defensive alliances among neighboring kin groups. Material culture reflects this consolidation. Weapon grave dated between 2080 CE become more numerous and standardized, indicating the emergence of a pan-regional warrior identity. Spearheads, shield bosses, and pattern-welded sword fragments display shared manufacturing traditions over a wide geographic area spanning from the lower Elbe to the Ems. This uniformity suggests sustained interaction among communities rather than isolated development. Metallurgical analysis indicates both local iron production and recycled Roman metal, demonstrating integration without dependence. The warrior became the central social figure not merely as a fighter, but as a political broker connecting households through loyalty and mutual obligation. Trade with the Roman world intensified after 50 CE. Excavations at river ports along the lower Elbe, including landing sites identified through preserved jetty timbers, reveal increasing quantities of Roman glassware, bronze vessels, and coinage dated to the Flavian period. These goods did not penetrate the economy evenly. They cluster in elite residences and high-status burial contexts. This selective distribution entrenched social stratification. Control over foreign goods translated directly into political capital. Authority no longer depended solely on lineage or land, but on access to transregional networks. The shift from subsistence equality to prestige hierarchy unfolded gradually but decisively. The landscape itself bore the marks of this evolving economy. Drainage ditches dated to the late 1st century CE appear along reclaimed marsh margins, indicating modest attempts at land reclamation. These were not state-led infrastructure projects, but communal undertakings coordinated at the kin group level. Soil micromorphology shows repeated episodes of flooding and repair rather than permanent stabilization. Human intervention improved productivity without erasing environmental risk. This balance between control and vulnerability would remain characteristic of the region for centuries. Ritual practice evolved alongside economic change. Depositions of weapons into bogs and river channels increased noticeably after 50 CE. Stratigraphic superposition demonstrates repeated offerings at the same sites across multiple generations. Organic residue on sword hilts and shield grips suggests ceremonial usage prior to deposition rather than battlefield discard. These acts transformed surplus weaponry into symbolic currency, binding martial power to sacred geography. Violence and belief became mutually reinforcing. The warrior's authority drew legitimacy not only from success in conflict, but from participation in ritual systems that transcended individual lifespans. Linguistic coherence also strengthened during this period. Although unwritten, the West Germanic dialect continuum stabilized its phonological structure between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE. Loanwords from Latin related to trade, military equipment, and administration enter the lexicon, indicating prolonged contact rather than episodic exchange. These linguistic traces preserve the invisible infrastructure of interaction. Speech, more than any artifact, records the depth of frontier entanglement. By 150 CE, the northern coastal world stood at the threshold of historical visibility. Its societies remained non-urban and non-literate, yet they operated within a continental system increasingly shaped by imperial power. Their mobility, maritime skill, and social flexibility equipped them to exploit emerging opportunities across the North Sea. The conditions that would later produce organized raiding, migration, and settlement beyond the continental homeland were now structurally in place. The pre-Saxon world had completed its long environmental and social gestation. What followed would no longer belong solely to prehistory. By the late 2nd century CE, stresses within the Roman frontier system began to reverberate more sharply across the northern periphery. Climatic reconstructions derived from Triering sequences indicate a phase of cooler, wetter conditions beginning around 160–170 CE, reducing agricultural reliability in marginal zones. Crop failures are archaeologically visible in the form of abandoned farmsteads and hastily infilled storage pits dated to this interval. At the same time, plague outbreaks within the Roman Empire after 165 CE disrupted trade flows and manpower availability along the Rhine. Fewer Roman goods penetrate inland contexts after 180 CE, and the coin supply in northern Germanic sites declines. Economic contraction at the imperial core translated into instability along its outer margins. This contraction sharpened the value of maritime mobility. Coastal and estuarine communities adapted more successfully than interior settlements because access to fish stocks, salt extraction, and seaborne exchange partially insulated them from agrarian failure. Salt briquettage remains dated to the 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE appear in greater density along the North Sea coast, indicating intensified production for regional redistribution. Salt was not only a preservative, but a strategic commodity, sustaining both human and animal populations during seasonal scarcity. Control over salt flats and tidal marshes thus conferred durable economic leverage independent of Roman supply chains. At the same time, political aggregation accelerated. Weapon-rich burials become increasingly concentrated in fewer cemeteries after 180 CE, while peripheral burial grounds decline in usage. This spatial contraction of elite display suggests that power was consolidating into narrower leadership strata. Radiographic analysis of skeletal trauma from these cemeteries shows a rising incidence of healed blade injuries, consistent with sustained low-intensity conflict rather than episodic warfare. Violence had become a routine social instrument. Authority now rested on the continuous capacity for organized force rather than sporadic defense. The maritime sphere expanded in parallel. Ship remains recovered from submerged channels off the Frisian coast and dated to 180–220 CE demonstrate increased hull size and reinforced rib structures compared to earlier craft. These vessels, reconstructed through timber curvature and fastening patterns, were capable of transporting larger crews over longer distances with greater seaworthiness. Such technical refinement did not emerge in isolation. It reflects both accumulated local experimentation and exposure to Southern shipbuilding traditions transmitted through trade contact. The North Sea was no longer a boundary zone. It had become a connective artery. Roman observers gradually registered this transformation. By the mid-3rd century CE, imperial records begin to refer explicitly to Saxons, a term likely derived from the Sikhs, the long knife or short sword widely carried in northern Germanic regions. The first appearance of the ethnonym occurs in coastal military reports compiled around 250–270 CE. This naming did not create the people it described. Rather, it signaled that a previously diffuse constellation of communities had coalesced into a recognizable political and military presence from the Roman perspective. Identity here emerged through external confrontation as much as internal cohesion. Archaeological horizons dated immediately before this textual emergence show precisely such a consolidation. Coastal fortifications constructed of earthen ramparts and timber palisades appear at several sites along the lower Elbe and Weser after 230 CE. These were not urban centers, but fortified assembly places, capable of gathering warbands and securing supply caches. Their distribution along navigable water routes, rather than inland ridge lines, underscores a strategic orientation toward maritime movement. The interface between river and sea had become the decisive geopolitical zone. Conceptually, the societies of this region had crossed a threshold. For millennia, identity had been anchored primarily in landscape, river bends, grazing cycles, ancestral burial grounds. By the 3rd century CE, identity increasingly attached to mobile groups organized for collective action over distance. This shift did not erase local attachment, but it layered a new scale of belonging upon it. Political meaning expanded from homestead and kin to warband and coalition. The psychological horizon of action had widened. The prehistory of the Saxons, therefore, ends not with a single migration or founding moment, but with a structural reorientation of society. Environmental adaptation produced maritime competence. Agricultural stabilization generated surplus. Trade created hierarchy. Conflict institutionalized leadership. By the time Roman chroniclers began to name the Saxons as a distinct force along the North Sea, the economic, technological, and social foundations of that identity were already centuries in the making. What enters the historical record in the 3rd century CE is not a people newly born, but a system newly visible. The wetland margins that once enforced isolation had become corridors of movement. The same rivers that once constrained settlement now projected power outward. From this point forward, Saxon history would unfold not as a local ethnography, but as a transregional force reshaping the balance between continent and island. By the early decades of the 3rd century CE, the transformation that had begun as a series of environmental adaptations and economic adjustments now expressed itself as a durable regional system capable of sustained external action. Settlement archaeology shows a final consolidation phase between 200 and 260 CE. Smaller farmsteads disappear from peripheral flood-prone zones, while larger, better-drained compounds persist on elevated sand ridges. This concentration pattern, confirmed through settlement surveys near the Middle Weser, indicates deliberate population pooling around defensible and economically reliable nodes. Field systems expand in regularity. Fence lines and boundary ditches dated by dendrochronology to this period demonstrate formalized land tenure rather than shifting seasonal use. The countryside was becoming politically legible. Maritime infrastructure expanded in parallel. Timber extraction from inland forests increased sharply after 200 CE, as shown by stump horizons in pollen cores taken from Lower Saxony bogs. The directionality of associated log transport traces, read through abrasion patterns and river deposit modeling, points consistently toward the coast. Shipbuilding had become a coordinated regional industry rather than an ad hoc household craft. The resulting vessels supported not only trade, but organized expeditionary movement. Crew sizes inferred from hull capacity estimates now exceeded extended family groups. Leadership scaled accordingly. Command over boats required command over men, supplies, and strategic timing. Weapon production followed the same pattern of intensification. Bog iron output rose markedly between 210 and 260 CE, visible in slag concentration layers surrounding furnace clusters. The standardization of blade forms across wide areas suggests centralized smithing traditions rather than isolated household manufacture. These weapons circulated through exchange and allegiance rather than open markets. Burial assemblages from this period show fewer weapons per grave, but higher quality per object, indicating elite monopolization of military resources. Control over violence had narrowed. Political authority increasingly rested with those who controlled production and distribution of arms. At the same time, new religious and ideological emphases emerged. Offerings shifted from individual weapons to collective deposits of multiple objects at single sites. Large-scale depositions from the early 3rd century CE contain dozens of spearheads, shield fittings, and sometimes animal remains, all ritualistically placed rather than scattered. These are not battlefield remnants. They represent communal acts of dedication tied to group identity rather than personal status. Belief systems were adapting to new scales of organization. Ritual now served coalition rather than lineage. Climatic instability continued to exert pressure. A sequence of severe storm surge events dated between 230 and 260 CE is recorded in coastal sediment stratigraphy. These floods inundated extensive grazing lands and may have destroyed earlier shoreline installations. Communities responded not by retreating inland permanently, but by hardening their reliance on maritime mobility. When land failed, water offered alternative sustenance and opportunity. This ecological logic reinforced outward orientation. The sea became not a boundary, but a field of action. By approximately 260 CE, the cumulative effect of these transformations was visible to the Roman administration. Frontier military correspondence begins to describe organized naval raiding along the Channel and North Sea coasts. These early Saxon expeditions were not the product of sudden barbarian impulse, but the expression of a society whose internal structures now supported sustained external projection. The long environmental apprenticeship of the wetlands had produced a people for whom fluid movement across unstable spaces was ordinary practice. In conceptual terms, the Saxon world had completed its passage from landscape-bound subsistence society to mobile political organism. Memory still resided in kin and grove, but power now moved with ships. Authority still derived from personal loyalty, but its reach extended beyond the horizon. The psychological transformation was as profound as the economic one. What had once been cycles of seasonal survival became cycles of strategic action. As the 3rd century advanced, Roman and Saxon frontiers did not merely meet, they began to interlock. Each system reshaped the other through pressure, imitation, and conflict. The Saxons were about to enter the written record not as obscure coastal farmers, but as an emerging maritime power confronting the largest empire of their age. The world of prehistory had ended. The world of recorded struggle was about to begin, where choice and consequence would operate on a visible stage. The next phase of this history unfolds not in peat bogs or pollen cores, but in military dispatches, fortification plans, and the first explicit naming of a people who had long existed without a name. By the opening decades of the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire had fixed its northern military horizon along the Rhine, transforming that river into both border and lens through which the peoples beyond it came into focus. The campaigns of Drusus between 12 and 9 BCE and of Tiberius shortly thereafter had pushed Roman armies deep into Germania before the Varian disaster of 9 CE forced a permanent strategic retreat. From that point onward, Rome no longer attempted full territorial conquest east of the Rhine. Instead, it governed through surveillance, diplomacy, and selective intervention. This new frontier regime generated the first systematic body of intelligence on the northern peoples. The Saxons, still unnamed, entered history obliquely through this administrative gaze. Tacitus, Germania, composed in 98 CE, distilled decades of military reporting into a coherent ethnographic framework. He described communities without cities, without architecture in stone, without codified law. Archaeological evidence from Lower Saxony aligns closely with this portrait. Settlement layers dated between 50 and 120 CE reveal light timber structures with shallow post holes, roofs of thatch, and minimal evidence of rebuilding on the same footprint. Occupation was continuous yet spatially flexible. When soil productivity declined or floods encroached, households shifted rather than reinforcing their ground. The built environment reflected a worldview in which permanence was neither possible nor pursued. Yet this surface simplicity concealed deep systemic integration with the Roman frontier. Excavations along the lower Elbe and Weser show a steady influx of Roman goods after 60 CE. Glass beakers, bronze strainers, and fragments of fine tableware appear in elite domestic contexts. Coin finds dated to the reigns of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian occur in inland settlements up to 150 kilometers from the Rhine. These objects did not signify Romanization in any cultural sense. They functioned instead as political instruments through which status hierarchies were articulated and alliances negotiated. To possess Roman material was to command influence over both people and exchange. This trade did not follow stable commercial routes. It moved through intermediary zones controlled by tribal brokers who managed access to Roman markets. Isotopic analysis of metal artifacts recovered from Saxon region burials shows that much of the bronze was recycled from older Roman military equipment rather than imported as finished goods. This implies secondary acquisition through gift exchange, plunder, or mercenary service rather than direct purchase. The frontier economy operated on personal obligation and strategic violence more than open transaction. Roman military recruitment played a decisive role in this process. From the late 1st century CE onward, Germanic auxiliaries formed a substantial portion of frontier garrisons. Diplomas issued to veterans upon discharge prove that soldiers from the North Sea region served in units stationed as far away as Britain and the Danube. These men returned with Roman training, tactical knowledge, and altered conceptions of command structure. The transmission of military practice through returning veterans is archaeologically visible in changes to weapon typology after 90 CE, including the adoption of Roman-influenced spearheads and standardized shield bosses. Warfare became more coordinated, more disciplined, and more scalable. The environmental backdrop continued to shape these developments. Flood periodicity along the North Sea coast remained high during the 1st and early 2nd centuries CE. Dendroclimatic data indicate alternating decades of relative stability and intense storm activity. Agricultural output fluctuated accordingly. In years of surplus, grain moved inland and outward along river routes. In years of failure, dependence on fishing and trade intensified. This ecological volatility favored communities that maintained wide political networks capable of redistributing resources under stress. Isolation became a liability. Connectivity became survival strategy. By the early 2nd century CE, the Roman frontier itself entered a phase of infrastructural expansion. The construction of stone forts, bridgeheads, and military roads between 100 and 140 CE stabilized garrison supply chains. This stabilization increased Roman demand for auxiliary manpower and provisioning from beyond the frontier. Germanic communities became integrated into imperial logistics without formal incorporation. Archaeological layers at river ports, such as Xanten and Nijmegen, show expanded warehouse facilities during this period. Northern goods moved south in greater volume. Roman silver moved north in response. It is within this intensifying zone of exchange and pressure that the political consolidation of the Saxon homeland accelerated. Weapon grave dated between 120 and 170 CE continue to increase in richness, but their spatial distribution narrows. Leadership was concentrating into fewer hands. At the same time, ritual deposition intensified in wetland contexts, particularly in weapons sacrifice. These dual patterns suggest that military authority and sacred legitimacy were being fused at the level of elite coalitions rather than diffuse kin groups. Conceptually, a new relationship between community and power was emerging. In earlier centuries, authority had been embedded in household and lineage. By the mid-2nd century CE, it increasingly attached to organized leadership over armed followers. The transformation was not ideological in the abstract sense. It was structural, driven by the external gravitational pull of Rome and the internal demands of ecological uncertainty. Political scale adjusted to systemic pressure. By 150 CE, the North Sea world had become an articulated frontier zone of the Roman system, even without formal annexation. Its societies remained technically barbarian in Roman jurisprudence, but functionally entangled in imperial supply, labor, and intelligence networks. The stage for direct confrontation was set not by sudden invasion, but by decades of incremental integration that made both dependence and resistance structurally inevitable. By the later 2nd century CE, this entanglement acquired a more coercive character. The long period of relative stability that had prevailed under the Antonine emperors began to fracture after 161 CE. The Marcomannic Wars along the Middle Danube consumed vast Roman military resources between 166 and 180 CE, while plague outbreaks documented by Galen devastated both civilian populations and army units. These shocks disrupted the equilibrium of frontier management. Troop redeployments weakened Rhine garrisons. Supply chains faltered. The flow of coin and manufactured goods into northern Germania thinned perceptibly after 180 CE, a pattern confirmed by the sharp decline of post-Commodus coinage in Saxon region hordes. Economic contraction within the empire transmitted instability outward. This contraction altered the incentive structure of frontier exchange. Where earlier access to Roman goods had depended on negotiated brokerage, scarcity now raised the returns to coercive acquisition. Archaeological destruction layers dated to the late 2nd century CE appear in several Rhine-adjacent Vicus settlements, indicating localized violence rather than organized war. At the same time, weapon deposition rates in the Saxon homeland surge again after a brief mid-century lull. The social economy of prestige recalibrated around conflict. Control of arms and captured Roman material now served as both economic resource and political currency. Environmental stress compounded these pressures. High-resolution dendrochronological sequences from northwestern Germany indicate a sequence of colder growing seasons after 180 CE, with suppressed tree-ring widths consistent with reduced summer temperatures. Pollen cores show temporary reforestation of marginal fields, suggesting agricultural retreat under climatic strain. This ecological contraction would have sharpened competition over arable land and pasture within the coastal zone. In such conditions, seaborne raiding offered a path to subsistence that bypassed terrestrial limits. The maritime turn that had begun as adaptive diversification now acquired existential urgency. Roman sources begin to reflect this change in security dynamics by the early 3rd century CE. Military dispatches referenced in later compilations report organized coastal attacks along the lower Rhine Delta and the northern Gallic shoreline around 210–230 CE. While these reports do not yet specify the Saxons by name, their geographic scope aligns precisely with the operational range of North Sea-based groups. The pattern of these attacks differs markedly from earlier opportunistic piracy. Targets included fortified harbors, supply depots, and lightly defended river ports. Such operations required coordinated planning, intelligence, and logistical capacity well beyond that of spontaneous raiding bands. Archaeological correlates confirm this escalation. Burn layers dated by ceramic typology and radiocarbon analysis to the early 3rd century CE appear at several coastal Gallic sites, including minor ports rather than major urban centers. These destructions are localized but systematic, consistent with repeated small-scale strikes rather than sweeping invasions. The attackers were probing the frontier, extracting material and testing Roman defensive responsiveness. The interaction between Roman and Saxon systems had entered a new phase characterized by reciprocal militarization. Within the Saxon homeland itself, the social effects of this transition are visible in burial practice. Between roughly 200 and 240 CE, grave goods exhibit a marked polarization. A small percentage of burials contain increasingly elaborate weapon assemblages and Roman-derived prestige items, while the majority display reduced inventories compared to earlier standards. Stable isotope data from skeletal remains in these elite grave indicate diets richer in animal protein relative to the general population. The material gap between leaders and followers widened. Wealth withdrawn from agricultural production and redirected through raiding and coercive exchange accumulated at the apex of emerging hierarchies. Ritual practice again adjusted to this altered political economy. Large communal weapon deposits placed in wetland sanctuaries during the early 3rd century CE now include Roman objects deliberately damaged before offering. Sword blades are bent, shields are perforated. The ritual neutralization of foreign power prior to dedication suggests a symbolic appropriation of Roman military potency into local cosmological frameworks. Violence against Rome was not merely practical. It had acquired ideological resonance. By approximately 250 CE, the Roman world faced a full systemic crisis. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire endured rapid imperial turnover, civil war, and external invasion. Frontier discipline weakened dramatically. In this vacuum, the maritime skills and organizational capacity of the Saxons advanced from raiding to persistent operational presence along the Channel and southern North Sea. It is at this juncture, in military documents compiled under Gallienus and his successors, that the term Saxons appears with increasing regularity. The name crystallizes at the same moment as the political phenomenon it denotes becomes impossible for Rome to ignore. The appearance of the Saxons in the written record, therefore, is not a nominal coincidence. It reflects a threshold at which diffuse coastal societies achieved sufficient cohesion and external impact to register as a strategic category within Roman imperial planning. Naming here is an act of recognition by an embattled state confronting a newly consolidated adversary. By the middle of the 3rd century CE, Roman strategic thinking toward the northern seas shifted from frontier management to coastal defense. The earlier assumption that the Rhine alone could contain external threat collapsed under the weight of repeated maritime penetration. Administrative reforms under Emperor Diocletian after 284 CE formalized this new reality. A chain of coastal fortifications, later known as the Litus Saxonicum, the Saxon shore, began to take shape along both the Gallic and British coasts. Archaeological dating places the earliest construction phases between 285 and 305 CE. These forts were not symbolic. Their dimensions, deep foundations, and integrated harbors indicate expectation of sustained naval threat rather than episodic piracy. Meanwhile, within the Saxon world, this same period marks the transition from opportunistic raiding to semi-regularized maritime warfare. Ship technology continued to evolve. Hull fragments recovered from submerged deposits near the Frisian coast and dated to approximately 250–280 CE show thicker planking, closer spaced ribs, and improved keel profiles, allowing better stability in open water conditions. These technical refinements expanded the operational window of sailing seasons and reduced weather dependency. Raiding could now be planned strategically rather than opportunistically. Maritime space became predictable enough to be militarized. The political consequences of this transformation were profound. Command over ships demanded coordinated provisioning, crew discipline, and intelligence about foreign coastlines. These requirements accelerated the centralization of authority within Saxon coalitions. Leadership increasingly crystallized around figures capable of organizing multi-ship expeditions rather than single warbands. Although no written Saxon records survive from this period, the archaeological concentration of high-status goods in fewer elite contexts after 260 CE indicates the emergence of suprakin leadership structures. Power was no longer merely inherited. It was operationally constructed through control of maritime force. Roman countermeasures reshaped the rhythm of confrontation. The Saxon shore forts, including installations at Brancaster, Branadunum, Borough Castle, Gariononum, and Portchester, were engineered to anchor naval patrols rather than simply to repel land assault. Their thick stone walls projecting bastions and harbor access points enabled rapid response to incursions. Tile stamps and construction inscriptions date their primary building phases to the reigns of Diocletian and Constantius Chlorus. Garrison units stationed here combined infantry with maritime detachments. The shoreline was now treated as a continuous military frontier. These defenses did not eliminate Saxon activity. They altered its character. Raids shifted from direct assaults on fortified points to strikes against infrastructure, agriculture, and shipping lanes. The object was disruption rather than occupation. Economic extraction replaced territorial ambition. Coin hoards buried along the eastern English coast and dated to the late 3rd century CE provide silent testimony to this insecurity. Their sudden concealment without recovery suggests communities responding to imminent threat rather than long-term instability. Inside the Saxon homeland, the cumulative impact of raiding wealth became visible in structural form. Large hall buildings dating to the late 3rd century, identified through post-hole patterns at sites along the Lower Weser, exceed earlier domestic structures in size and architectural complexity. These halls functioned not as ordinary dwellings, but as political centers for assembly, feasting, and redistribution. The emergence of such fixed elite spaces marks a decisive departure from the earlier pattern of dispersed, equal households. Political gravity now anchored in identifiable loci of power. The ideological implications of this change were equally significant. Earlier ritual practice focused on localized wetland offerings tied to kin and seasonal cycles. By the late 3rd century, evidence appears for more centralized cult sites associated with elite residences. Sacrificial deposits increasingly cluster near power centers rather than dispersed marsh locations. Religion began to mirror political hierarchy. Sacred authority followed secular command. The cosmology of the Saxon world adapted to the realities of centralized force without abandoning its older landscape-rooted traditions. From the Roman perspective, the Northern Sea now represented a persistent strategic liability. Imperial naval units, weakened by decades of fiscal strain and internal conflict, struggled to enforce maritime security across such an extensive littoral. The Roman state responded not by attempting full repression beyond the frontier, but by hardening the zones it could still control. Britain, once a stabilized province, became increasingly militarized. The Channel ceased to function primarily as a commercial corridor and became a contested military space. By the end of the 3rd century CE, Saxon-Roman interaction had hardened into a system of structured antagonism. Neither side possessed the capacity to eliminate the other. Instead, each adapted institutionally to the other's presence. Roman coastal defense architecture, administrative reforms, and naval patrols emerged in response to Saxon maritime pressure. Saxon political consolidation, technological refinement, and elite hierarchy emerged in response to Roman economic gravity and military vulnerability. The encounter between these two systems did not yet determine the future of Britain or Northern Europe. It established a long-term dynamic of mutual conditioning. What had begun centuries earlier as distal trade contact had evolved into a frontier war fought across water rather than land. The conditions were now in place for the next structural shift, the transformation of raiding into settlement and of maritime violence into territorial power. By the opening years of the 4th century CE, the frontier between Roman order and Saxon mobility had achieved a tense equilibrium. Diocletian's administrative reforms after 293 CE divided imperial command into smaller, more tightly supervised units, improving internal coherence but stretching resources thin across multiple threatened zones. Britain, isolated by sea and dependent on long supply chains, became increasingly vulnerable to disruption. The Saxon shore forts functioned as both shield and signal, intended to reassure provincial populations while advertising imperial control. Yet the archaeological record suggests that these installations strained local economies through the taxation and requisitions required to maintain their garrisons. Defensive stability came at mounting fiscal cost. Saxon activity adjusted to this fortified environment with tactical restraint rather than retreat. Attacks became more selective, focusing on shipping, isolated estates, and seasonal vulnerability rather than fortified infrastructure. Ceramic distribution patterns along the British East Coast show abrupt interruptions in rural occupation layers during the early 4th century, followed by reoccupation under less intensive land use. These interruptions correlate with contemporary military reports of coastal insecurity rather than with climatic downturn, indicating human rather than environmental causation. Agricultural retreat was a response to threat, not to failed harvest. Within the Saxon homeland, the social consequences of sustained external predation became more formalized. By approximately 300 CE, burial assemblages reveal the stabilization of a warrior aristocracy whose status transmitted intergenerationally rather than through episodic success. Genealogical continuity, though unwritten, solidified through inherited weaponry, long-established hall sites, and ritual authority concentrated in elite hands. Isotopic studies of early 4th century cemeteries along the lower Elbe show greater dietary consistency across elite lineages than among non-elite populations, reinforcing the impression of durable aristocratic households rather than transient leadership. This consolidation altered the internal economy. Agricultural production became increasingly subordinated to the provisioning needs of raiding fleets and retinues rather than purely local subsistence. Storage facilities expand in elite compounds. Surplus moved toward political centers, redistributed through feasting, gift exchange, and equipment provisioning. The old subsistence balance between land and water tipped unmistakably toward maritime orientation. Economic life now revolved around the requirements of external projection rather than internal sustainability alone. The Roman state, for its part, increasingly relied on Germanic manpower to compensate for its own demographic and fiscal limits. By the early 4th century, auxiliary units recruited from the North Sea region served not only along the Rhine, but within Britain itself. The paradox of frontier defense deepened. The same population that generated maritime threat also supplied the labor used to suppress it. Diplomas issued between 290 and 320 CE attest to the settlement of discharged Germanic veterans on frontier lands under Roman jurisdiction. These individuals became conduits of cultural and military knowledge in both directions. The frontier ceased to be a simple line of separation. It became a zone of continuous human circulation. This permeability of separation produced long-term unintended effects. Returning veterans introduced Roman tactical discipline, Latin administrative terminology, and altered conceptions of territorial command into Saxon leadership culture. Archaeological horizons dated to the early 4th century show further standardization of weapon forms and the appearance of belt fittings modeled closely on Roman military equipment. These were not imitations of fashion. They reflected the internalization of Roman organizational norms by a society that remained formally outside imperial control. The techniques of empire diffused into the architecture of its challengers. At the same time, Roman attempts to stabilize Britain through localized fortification and auxiliary recruitment produced only temporary containment. The province's urban network had already weakened after the late 3rd century crisis. Coin circulation declined steadily after 296 CE in many British towns. Public building maintenance lapsed. Military protection, fragmented into regional command zones, focused almost exclusively on defense rather than civil administration. Britain remained loyal to the empire in name, but its integration into wider imperial systems thinned with each decade. By the mid-4th century CE, the cumulative weight of these adjustments had produced a frontier that no longer resembled the rigid boundary envisioned by Augustan strategists. It had become a fluctuating interface shaped by reciprocal dependency, shared technology, and intermittent violence. Saxon political organization had matured within this environment of sustained contact. It now possessed the structural capacity not only to raid, but eventually to occupy. Roman Britain, in turn, had become a defended space increasingly aware that defense alone could not restore long-term stability. The system that emerged from 3 centuries of interaction between Rome and the North Sea world was therefore not one of simple opposition. It was a hybrid frontier economy in which militarization, exchange, and cultural transmission operated simultaneously. The Saxons had learned how the Roman world functioned, how it defended itself, and where its vulnerabilities lay. Rome had learned that its northern sea frontier demanded continuous attention rather than episodic response. The long preparatory phase was drawing to a close. What followed would test not merely the resilience of Roman coastal defenses, but the sustainability of Roman power in Britain itself. By the final decades of the 4th century CE, the balance that had governed Roman-Saxon relations for nearly 200 years eroded under converging systemic pressures. The Roman imperial state, though formally reunified after the Tetrarchic reforms, remained structurally strained by military expenditure, demographic contraction, and administrative overextension. Britain, situated at the furthest logistical edge of the empire, felt these strains earlier and more acutely than most provinces. Garrison pay became irregular. Coin supply thinned after 360 CE. Rural estates increasingly turned inward toward localized subsistence rather than market integration. Evidence from villa sites in eastern Britain shows declining maintenance after mid-century, with mosaic floors left unrepaired and hypercourse systems dismantled for raw material. The infrastructure of provincial life no longer received consistent state support. Saxon pressure persisted through these weakening conditions with increasing regularity. Roman military registers compiled in the 360s mention continuous coastal vigilance rather than episodic alert. Ammianus Marcellinus records a coordinated threat from Picts, Scotti, and Saxons during the so-called Great Conspiracy of 367 CE, when northern and western Britain were simultaneously overrun while Saxon fleets attacked the eastern coast. The Roman response under Count Theodosius temporarily restored order, but the scale of the crisis revealed how thin imperial control had become. The fact that Saxon forces could participate in such synchronized multi-front action demonstrates the maturity of their maritime and political organization by this date. Archaeological layers in eastern Britain dated to the late 4th century corroborate these textual accounts. Hoards buried between 365 and 375 CE in Essex, Norfolk, and Lincolnshire display uniform patterns of emergency concealment. Many contain clipped coinage, indicating monetary scarcity and the breakdown of standard fiscal circulation. In the same regions, coastal farmsteads show abrupt abandonment followed by later reoccupation under altered layouts. These patterns suggest not annihilation, but strategic withdrawal from exposed zones that could no longer be defended reliably. The countryside adapted more quickly than the state. Within the Saxon homeland, the later 4th century marks the final stage of political hardening before the transition to settlement beyond the sea. Elite hall complexes expanded further in both size and permanence. Timber halls dated by dendrochronology to the 370s and 380s exhibit repeated rebuilding on the same footprints, signaling entrenched dynastic authority rather than temporary command. Storage capacity continued to increase, indicating accumulation not merely of subsistence surplus, but of material necessary for sustained external operations. The logistical basis for overseas expansion was now in place. Ideologically, the Saxon world remained religiously rooted in ancestral cult and warrior ritual, but its political imagination had widened decisively. Power was no longer conceived solely in terms of seasonal leadership over followers. It now encompassed territorial ambition across water. Contact with Roman provincial landholding, taxation, and governance had demonstrated the benefits of fixed control over productive landscapes. The Roman example, observed from beyond the frontier and partially internalized through veterans and intermediaries, reshaped Saxon conceptions of what power could be. Raiding alone no longer exhausted the horizon of political possibility. By the final quarter of the 4th century CE, Roman Britain had become structurally dependent on forces it could neither fully control nor permanently exclude. Saxon groups operated simultaneously as enemies, mercenaries, and trading partners depending on circumstance. The frontier system had shifted from one of external containment to one of unstable interpenetration. Security was episodic. Sovereignty was increasingly negotiated rather than enforced. The imperial continuation of Britain now rested on fragile administrative scaffolding rather than deep institutional integration. This transitional condition did not yet constitute collapse. Roman authority persisted in law and title. Fortresses remained garrisoned. Imperial officials continued to govern, yet the systemic prerequisites for long-term stability were already absent. The mechanisms that had once regenerated Roman power at the periphery, taxation, urban administration, and controlled military recruitment, functioned only partially. The cost of maintaining coercion now exceeded the resources reliably available to fund it. From the Saxon perspective, the conditions across the sea began to resemble not a fortified frontier, but a fractured landscape of opportunity. Knowledge accumulated over generations of contact had revealed harbors, supply patterns, seasonal vulnerabilities, and internal political divisions. These were no longer abstractions. They formed a practical geographical intelligence network transmitted orally through veteran lineages and maritime leaders. As the 4th century closed, one world stood militarized but hollowed, the other consolidated and outward-looking. The long encounter between Rome and the Saxons had created a frontier that could no longer be stabilized through defense alone. What followed would no longer be defined primarily by raid and counteraid, but by the movement of entire peoples across the sea and the irreversible transformation of Britain itself. The conditions that would soon pull Saxon warbands from predators into settlers were now fully in place. By 300 CE, Roman Britain existed within a defensive architecture increasingly defined by maritime threat. The construction of the Saxon shore forts between roughly 285 and 305 CE represented the most extensive coastal militarization project ever undertaken in the province. Archaeological dating at Brancaster, Borough Castle, Richborough, Dover, and Portchester confirms near-synchronous development under the Tetrarchic regime. These installations were massive by late Roman standards. Walls exceeded 3 meters in thickness, towers projected outward for flanking fire, and internal harbors allowed direct interface between land garrisons and naval patrols. Tile stamps bearing the names of imperial workshops attest to centralized state investment on a scale incompatible with short-term emergency. Rome now treated the Northern Sea as a permanent war front. Yet the very need for such fortification reveals the fragility of Roman control beyond the shoreline. Britain's economy had already begun to contract after the late 3rd century crisis. Coin circulation recovered briefly under Diocletian, but declined again after 330 CE. Market exchange narrowed. Long-distance trade weakened. Rural production increasingly served local demand and garrison provisioning rather than imperial export. Excavations at coastal estates in eastern Britain show storage facilities repurposed for military supply rather than civilian surplus. The province was becoming a frontier economy in its own right rather than an integrated component of the Mediterranean system. Saxon activity adapted to this tilting strategic balance with pragmatic restraint. Direct assaults on fortified shore installations were rare. Instead, raiding focused on shipping lanes, river mouths, and unprotected agricultural zones. Harbor approaches and estuaries offered higher returns at lower risk than stone-walled strongholds. Archaeological evidence from wreck sites in the southern North Sea, dated to the early 4th century by hull construction and cargo typology, reveals losses consistent with interception rather than storm destruction. Maritime violence increasingly targeted economic lifelines rather than symbolic centers of power. Inside the Saxon homeland, the demands of sustained pressure against a fortified opponent further intensified political centralization. Elite compounds expanded again in the first half of the 4th century. Hall buildings grew longer, storage pits deeper, and craft areas more specialized. Archaeometallurgical debris clustered more tightly around these centers, indicating elite control over weapon production rather than dispersed household smithing. The coordination of fleet operations required predictable supply of arms, timber, and food. Political authority crystallized around those who could maintain this logistical flow. Roman responses to Saxon pressure relied increasingly on negotiated containment rather than outright suppression. The frontier system was now too extensive to dominate solely by force. Auxiliary recruitment from Germanic regions of the North Sea continued and even intensified during the early 4th century. Diplomas dated between 310 and 340 CE demonstrate sustained incorporation of these populations into Roman military structures. Some of these recruits almost certainly originated from the same coastal societies engaged in raiding operations. The contradiction was structural. Rome now attempted to stabilize the frontier by embedding its adversaries within its own chain of command. This strategy produced short-term tactical successes but long-term strategic vulnerability. Risk and intelligence diffused in both directions. Knowledge of British harbors, defenses, and supply routes circulated among Saxon networks through returning veterans and mercenary intermediaries. In the archaeological record, this transfer appears in the appearance of Roman military fittings and belt gear in Saxon elite Grave after 320 CE. These objects were not trophies alone. They signified familiarity with Roman organization at an operational level. By the 350s CE, the Roman defensive system in Britain operated under chronic strain. Ammianus Marcellinus records repeated coastal alarms and emergency redeployments of troops from the interior. The need to suppress internal revolts elsewhere in the empire further drained British garrisons. Units were withdrawn to fight on continental fronts and not fully replaced. Coin hoards concealed during these decades indicate localized panic rather than total collapse. Roman control still functioned, but it did so reactively rather than proactively. The Great Conspiracy of 367 CE exposed the structural limits of this reactive posture. Coordinated attacks by Picts from the north, Scotti from the west, and Saxons from the east overwhelmed border defenses simultaneously. Coastal surveillance failed. Supply depots were seized. Sections of Hadrian's Wall were breached. Civil administration collapsed across wide zones of the province. The Roman recovery under Count Theodosius was swift but costly. Garrisons were rebuilt. Forts were reoccupied. Yet the episode permanently demonstrated that Britain could no longer be secured through coastal fortification and auxiliary recruitment alone. The province had become strategically brittle. From the Saxon side, the late 4th century marked the decisive recognition that Roman Britain could be entered not only as raiders, but eventually as settlers. The distribution of raiding shifted toward sustained seasonal patterns. Small groups returned to familiar river systems year after year. Geographic knowledge accumulated into inherited operational memory. The sea ceased to represent the edge of the known world. It became a routine corridor of movement. By the 380s CE, Roman fiscal extraction in Britain weakened further. Tax arrears multiplied. Troops often received land or supplies in lieu of currency. Civil officials relied increasingly on local aristocratic cooperation for administrative continuity. Political authority thinned from imperial command into provincial accommodation. The Roman state remained present, but it no longer monopolized coercive power within the province. The shore forts still stood, the banners still flew, yet the deeper foundations of Roman order, predictable taxation, centralized pay, and integrated logistics, had begun to erode. The defensive superstructure now rested on decaying economic supports. Britain was becoming a militarized island without a sustainable imperial economy behind it. Across the North Sea, the Saxon world watched this transformation with measured calculation rather than sudden opportunism. The movement from raiding to settlement would not occur as a single campaign. It would emerge through decades of escalating presence in a province whose defensive shell remained intact even as its internal cohesion weakened. The conditions for Roman withdrawal were now latent within the system itself, awaiting a final external shock to render them irreversible. By the very end of the 4th century CE, the political equilibrium in Britain depended increasingly on local initiative rather than imperial coordination. After Theodosius' restoration in 369 CE, the Roman military presence was numerically sufficient but strategically fragmented. Garrisons were scattered, supply chains were shortened, and command structure leaned heavily on regional officers rather than centralized authority. Archaeological evidence from forts such as Pevensey and Borough Castle shows continued occupation into the early 5th century, but repair work becomes rougher and less standardized after 380 CE, indicating declining access to imperial construction resources. The walls endured. The system that maintained them did not. Coin circulation offers a precise measure of this erosion. After the last significant issues under Magnus Maximus in the 380s, new coinage becomes increasingly scarce in Britain. By approximately 402-404 CE, fresh imperial currency all but ceases to arrive in the province. Excavation layers from this period show growing reliance on clipped and heavily worn coins, sometimes alongside improvised local tokens. Fiscal integration with the Central Empire had effectively collapsed. A state that could no longer pay its army in regular currency could only govern through negotiated loyalty. At the same time, the Western Empire faced existential crisis on the continent. Between 395 and 410 CE, Roman forces were repeatedly redeployed to confront Gothic, Vandal, and Alanic incursions across the Rhine and Danube. Britain, logistically remote and no longer a primary economic contributor, became a strategic afterthought. The withdrawal of mobile field units left only static garrisons to maintain order. These troops were sufficient for local defense, but incapable of deterrence against coordinated external pressure. Saxon maritime activity escalated accordingly in both frequency and ambition. Raiding groups now overwintered in or near British territory rather than returning across the sea after each campaign. Temporary encampments left minimal material trace, yet their presence is indirectly confirmed by repeated late Roman abandonment layers in exposed coastal zones. The shift from seasonal hit-and-run raids to sustained presence marks a critical threshold. The sea was no longer merely a conduit of attack. It had become a bridge for semi-permanent migration. The Roman response to this new reality became increasingly improvised. Local commanders entered into ad hoc agreements with Germanic groups, exchanging access to land or provisions for military service. Such arrangements are not explicitly documented in Britain at this date, but they are well attested elsewhere in the Western Empire and consistent with archaeological patterns of mixed material culture emerging in late Roman coastal contexts. The frontier logic of federated defense began to supersede direct imperial rule. By 406 CE, the structural fragility of Roman Britain was exposed by events far beyond its shores. On the last day of that year, a coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine in Gaul, triggering a cascade of military emergencies across the western provinces. Britain's garrisoned forces were increasingly isolated from continental support at precisely the moment when external pressure intensified. The imperial centre no longer possessed the capacity to respond decisively to British needs. The political rupture came swiftly. In 409 CE, provincial elites in Britain expelled Roman civil officials after a series of failed usurpations and military withdrawals. In 410 CE, the rescript of Honorius formally acknowledged that the inhabitants of Britain must henceforth look to their own defense. The document did not announce a dramatic conquest. It recorded administrative abdication. Roman sovereignty in Britain ended not with a final battle, but with the quiet collapse of fiscal and military obligation. From the Saxon perspective, this moment did not immediately signify triumph. It signified opportunity. The province across the sea had lost its central protector, but retained its agricultural wealth, transport infrastructure, and fragmented local leadership. The shore forts still stood, but they now belonged to a world without imperial reinforcement. Britain had become structurally autonomous and strategically vulnerable at the same time. The end of Roman Britain, therefore, represents less a sudden fall than a systemic withdrawal from a frontier that could no longer be supported. For the Saxons and their kin, the transformation of the western shore from defended boundary to open landscape altered the logic of engagement fundamentally. Raids would no longer be the sole mode of interaction. Settlement, negotiated dominance, and territorial control now entered the realm of practical possibility. The Roman world had receded from the North Sea not through defeat alone, but through exhaustion. In its wake remained a militarized, agriculturally productive, and politically fragmented island whose fate would now be determined not by imperial decree, but by the movement of peoples across the water. In the decades following the Roman withdrawal of 410 CE, Britain entered a prolonged interval of political fragmentation in which no central authority replaced the imperium that had departed. Urban administration collapsed almost immediately. Coin circulation disappeared within a generation. Long-distance trade with the continent contracted to trace levels by 430 CE. Archaeological sequences from former Roman towns, such as Verulamium, Silchester, and Wroxeter, show progressive abandonment of public buildings, followed by opportunistic timber reuse rather than formal civic maintenance. Britain did not descend into sudden chaos, but it lost the institutional mechanisms that had once coordinated defense, taxation, and regional governance. Power reverted to local landholding elites, former military officers, and fortified communities operating without supraprovincial coordination. It is within this structural vacuum that sustained Germanic settlement becomes archaeologically visible after approximately 430 CE. The movement was not a singular invasion, but a multi-decade demographic process involving Saxons, Angles, and Jutes operating along similar maritime corridors. Burial assemblages provide the clearest chronological markers of this transformation. Radiocarbon-dated cemeteries at sites such as Spung Hill in Norfolk, Mucking in Essex, and Buckland in Kent reveal a sharp population increase between 440 and 500 CE dominated by distinctly continental Germanic material culture. Cremation urns with stamped and incised decoration replace late Roman inhumation traditions across eastern Britain with remarkable speed. Cultural replacement, not integration, structured the settlement phase. The migration drew upon the same maritime networks that had once supported raiding. Ship-based movement allowed flexible transportation of warbands, families, livestock, and portable wealth. Hull capacity estimates derived from later early medieval ship finds suggest that even modest vessels could carry entire kin groups across the North Sea in staged crossings. The sound of shipbuilding and beaching became a recurring feature along the British coast during the mid-5th century. These movements did not require the collapse of all Roman defensive structures. They required only sufficient fragmentation of local resistance to permit piecemeal occupation. Textual sources record the political logic of this process in fragmentary form. Gilders, writing in the early 6th century, describes British leaders recruiting Saxon mercenaries during the 440s to repel northern raiders. Whether this account preserves literal contractual settlement or compresses decades of interaction into moral narrative, the archaeological outcome is unambiguous. By 480 CE, Germanic material culture dominates the eastern lowlands from Kent north to the Humber. Agricultural field systems reorganize. Settlement orientation shifts from Roman road networks toward river corridors and coastal zones. The internal geometry of the landscape is redrawn. Isotopic analysis of early Anglo-Saxon skeletal remains confirms that migration involved substantial population movement rather than solely elite replacement. Strontium and oxygen isotope signatures from 5th century burials in eastern England indicate childhood origins consistent with coastal northern Germany and southern Scandinavia rather than Britain. These data anchor the demographic reality of settlement in physical movement across the sea. The migrants were not limited to warriors. They included women, children, and whole households. Colonization, not occupation, was underway. The political organization of these communities initially followed continental patterns. Authority rested with war leaders whose legitimacy derived from control over armed followers, access to land, and success in securing agricultural surplus. Settlements consisted of loosely clustered farmsteads organized around extended kin groups rather than fortified towns. Sunken-featured buildings used for storage and craft production appear widely after 450 CE. Timber longhouses served as both domestic and economic centers. There is no archaeological evidence for Roman-style urban governance within these new zones of control. Power operated through personal obligation rather than civic administration. Conflict with remaining Romano-British populations accompanied this expansion unevenly. In some regions, especially in eastern lowlands with sparse late Roman habitation, settlement proceeded with minimal visible resistance. In others, notably along the western margins and in the upper Thames basin, fortified sites and weapon burials attest to sustained contestation through the late 5th century. Burn layers dated to the 470s and 480s in several former villa landscapes suggest episodes of violent displacement rather than negotiated coexistence. The British political order, already decentralized, proved incapable of mounting coordinated resistance at regional scale. Language transition followed settlement patterns with demographic precision. Old English rapidly replaced British Celtic speech across eastern and central Britain within 2 generations. Place name distributions record this process in durable linguistic strata. Hydronyms often preserve earlier Brittonic roots, while settlement names adopt Germanic forms almost exclusively. This pattern reflects replacement of ruling and farming populations rather than simple elite dominance over indigenous communities. Speech maps the movement of people as reliably as grave goods or house plans. Agricultural systems adjusted accordingly. Roman villa economies based on estate-level monoculture gave way to smaller-scale mixed farming oriented toward household subsistence and local exchange. Open field systems emerge unevenly after 500 CE. The plough replaces the Roman ard in many regions, reshaping soil utilization and crop rotation. Livestock management shifts toward cattle and sheep rather than the horse-heavy economy of late Roman estates. The soundscape of the countryside changes with it. The rhythm of production is no longer regulated by imperial calendar and tax cycle, but by communal seasonal labor. By approximately 500 CE, the landscape of eastern Britain had undergone irreversible transformation. The Roman province had become a Germanic-speaking agrarian frontier structured by kin authority rather than bureaucratic governance. Political boundaries were fluid, but territorial control was increasingly stable at local scale. What emerged was not yet England in any institutional sense, but a mosaic of embryonic kingdoms rooted in the demographic realities of migration. The movement that began as opportunistic settlement under conditions of Roman collapse had now created a new cultural geography across half the island. The question was no longer whether the Saxons and their kin would remain in Britain. It was how these scattered communities would consolidate power among themselves. The next stage of consolidation unfolded unevenly between roughly 480 and 550 CE as the scattered migrant communities transitioned from mobile settlement groups into territorially anchored polities. Archaeological signatures of this shift appear in the growing permanence of settlement sites. Early timber halls, once rebuilt frequently, begin to persist across multiple generations on the same footprints. Boundary ditches deepen. Field systems stabilize. In regions such as Kent and East Anglia, continuous habitation layers from the late 5th through early 6th centuries demonstrate that landholding had become inheritable rather than merely occupied. The temporary logic of colonization gave way to the durable logic of territorial control. Political authority followed this stabilization. Elite burials dated between 500 and 540 CE display increasing differentiation in wealth and ceremonial display. Weapon assemblages become more standardized, while jewelry exhibits regional stylistic coherence, signaling the emergence of dynastic identity rather than individualized status. Gold bracteates, glass claw beakers, and garnet-inlaid fittings appear in high-status grave across southeastern Britain, linking emerging rulers to continental prestige networks. These objects functioned as instruments of legitimacy. Power now required visible material confirmation as well as military capability. Kent provides the earliest clear case of institutional kingship. Frankish imports including coinage and burial goods dated to the reign of Childeric I in the late 5th century, appear in Kentish contexts by approximately 480–500 CE. This contact suggests diplomatic alignment with Merovingian Gaul and the adoption of continental models of hereditary monarchy. Unlike earlier war leadership, which dissolved with the death of the leader, kingship in this period began to articulate continuity across generations. Authority was no longer solely personal, it became dynastic. Elsewhere, similar processes took shape at different speeds. In East Anglia, large cremation cemeteries gave way gradually to fewer, more exclusive burial grounds after 520 CE, indicating narrowing aristocratic control. In the Upper Thames Valley, settlement densities increase while fortification recurs on prominent ridges, reflecting zones of sustained contestation. These differences reflect not a uniform invasion, but a patchwork of locally negotiated power structures, responding to distinct demographic and geographic conditions. The consolidation of kingship reshaped military organization. Warbands once assembled for episodic raiding now formed permanent retinues attached to royal households. Weapon production centralized around elite halls. Stable isotope analysis of retainer burials suggests long-term dependence on royal provisioning rather than household self-sufficiency. Military force had become institutionally sustained rather than situational. This altered the scale of conflict. Warfare increasingly targeted territory and submission rather than movable wealth. The transformation extended into law and social regulation. Although no written law codes survive from this earliest phase, later texts preserve structural features that point unmistakably to 6th century origins. Wergild values, kin obligation, and hierarchical fines reflect a society ordered by gradations of legal worth tied to proximity to royal power. The institutionalization of compensation rather than vendetta as the preferred mechanism of dispute resolution indicates the growing authority of centralized adjudication. Political consolidation required predictable justice to stabilize land and labor relations. Agricultural practice evolved in tandem with these legal and military shifts. As territorial boundaries hardened, long-term investment in land improvement increased. Heavy plows with iron coulters appear more frequently after 500 CE, enabling deeper cultivation of heavier soils. Crop spectra diversify. Rye and oats join barley and wheat as staple cereals in many regions. Storage capacity grows. These changes reflect not merely technological adoption, but the security required to invest in multi-year productivity. Political stability translated directly into agricultural intensification. Interaction with surviving Romano-British populations did not cease during this consolidation. In western border zones, particularly in the Severn Valley and along the Chiltern Escarpment, material culture exhibits prolonged hybridity through the early 6th century. Germanic-style brooches appear in otherwise Romano-British burial contexts, while British ceramic traditions persist within Germanic farmsteads. These overlaps indicate zones of protracted contact rather than immediate displacement. Cultural boundaries were enforced unevenly, shaped by local power balances rather than categorical ethnic divisions. Yet the overall demographic trajectory remained unmistakably directional. By 550 CE, Old English dominated the linguistic landscape throughout eastern and central Britain. Place name clusters based on tribal and familial identifiers record the territorialization of migrant groups into enduring polities. What began as maritime colonization had produced rooted communities with inherited land, formal leadership, and expanding institutional capacity. The structural foundation of Anglo-Saxon England was therefore not imposed from above through conquest alone. It emerged from the gradual conversion of migratory violence into settled authority, of household autonomy into dynastic governance. The resulting political units were small by later standards, but they were no longer transient. They commanded land, labor, and loyalty across generations. The fragmented post-Roman landscape had now been replaced by a new order of Germanic kingship. The next phase of this transformation would be defined not by migration, but by the stabilization of sacred authority, law, and kingship within an explicitly pagan political world. The religious framework that supported this early phase of kingship remained explicitly pagan, structured around ancestral cult, sacred landscape, and the ritual validation of ver la through warfare and fertility. Archaeological indicators of belief appear not in temples but in deposition patterns and burial symbolism. Weapon grave, animal offerings, and cremation rites dominated mortuary expression across the 5th and early 6th centuries. The grave was not merely a place of memory, but a political instrument through which lineage and legitimacy were displayed. Elite burials positioned on ridgelines and near territorial boundaries functioned as durable claims to land as much as commemorations of the dead. Ritual landscapes clustered at river confluences, boundary zones, and assembly places where legal and military decisions converged. Though the names of Saxon deities are largely lost to direct documentation at this stage, later sources and comparative Germanic religion indicate cultic emphasis on war, kin, and fertility. Sacred authority remained diffuse rather than clerical. Power resided in the king as both military leader and ritual guarantor of communal prosperity. There was no priestly caste independent of political authority. Kings ruled by force and by favor of the unseen. This fusion of sacred and secular power shaped how these early kingdoms expanded. Political growth did not proceed through bureaucratic incorporation, but through personal subordination sealed by oath and tribute. Smaller communities submitted to stronger rulers in exchange for protection and access to redistributed wealth. Warfare functioned less as a totalizing struggle for annihilation than as a mechanism for recalibrating hierarchy. Tribute payments, hostages, and marriage alliances translated military outcomes into lasting political structure. Material evidence from the late 5th and early 6th centuries records the entrenchment of this system. Hoards of gold and silver jewelry buried in this period often appear near known elite centers rather than in dispersed rural contexts. These deposits likely represent emergency concealment during political upheaval or ritualized withdrawal of wealth from circulation. Their contents demonstrate sustained access to continental metal supplies long after formal Roman trade networks had vanished. The new kingdoms were not isolated. They remained embedded within North Sea exchange systems linking Britain, Frisia, and the Lower Rhine. The geography of power hardened accordingly. In southern and eastern Britain, river corridors such as the Thames, Medway, and Great Ouse formed the spines along which early kingdoms articulated their territorial reach. Control of river transport translated directly into control of surplus and movement. The settlement patterns visible along these waterways display higher densities, greater architectural investment, and richer burial assemblages than surrounding hinterlands. Political space organized itself along water rather than road, reversing the spatial logic of Roman administration. Warriors attached to royal households now formed permanent military corps rather than temporary seasonal bands. Their lives were no longer divided primarily between farming and fighting. Isotopic evidence from elite cemeteries suggests diets sustained by centralized provisioning rather than household agriculture. The warrior had become a professionalized social type whose survival depended on continued success in conflict and the maintenance of royal favor. Loyalty became contractual. Defection became treason rather than mere misfortune. Yet despite this institutional hardening, early Anglo-Saxon kingship remained volatile. Succession was rarely peaceful. Legitimacy depended not simply on birth, but on the ability to command armed support. Dynastic continuity was aspirational rather than assured. When a ruler died, the political structure often fractured along kin lines until a new equilibrium emerged through violence. This instability limited the spatial scale of early kingdoms. Power remained intensely territorial and personal, confined to the practical reach of military force. The demographic consequences of early consolidation also became visible by the mid-6th century. Settlement expansion slowed, burial populations stabilized. The initial phase of mass migration had ended. Thereafter, population growth depended primarily on internal reproduction rather than continued influx from the continent. Isotopic markers from later 6th century burials show declining proportions of non-local childhood origins. The Saxon world in Britain had become self-generating. The transformation from migrant society to indigenous population was now complete. This stabilization did not bring cultural uniformity. Regional identities strengthened as political units matured along separate ecological and strategic lines. Coastal polities remained oriented toward maritime exchange and raiding. Inland polities emphasized control of river basins and agricultural surplus. Material culture diversified accordingly. Brooch styles, weapon forms, and burial rites display increasing regional differentiation after 520 CE. A shared Germanic foundation persisted, but it fractured into distinct political cultures tied to specific landscapes. By the middle of the 6th century, eastern and southern Britain were no longer a frontier zone of movement. They had hardened into a patchwork of young kingdoms bound together by conflict, alliance, and shared cosmological structures. The mechanisms of political life, kingship, retinue, tribute, and law, were now fully internal to the island. External migration no longer drove historical change at this scale. The period of settlement had therefore given way to the period of internal competition. The question that now defined the future was not how Saxon power entered Britain, but how it would be ordered, legitimized, and ultimately transformed by forces yet to arrive. By the later decades of the 6th century, the internal logic of these early kingdoms generated pressures that simple kin-based rule could no longer absorb. As landed wealth accumulated and warrior retinues became permanent, disputes over succession, tribute, and boundary intensified. Archaeological surveys of settlement expansion during this period show the infilling of previously marginal land, particularly along river terraces and light upland soils. The ecological ceiling of early subsistence farming was being tested. Political competition now directly intersected with resource limitation. Warfare, once episodic, became structurally recurrent. Evidence for this escalation appears in the density and distribution of weapon burials dated between 540 and 580 CE. In several regions, especially the Upper Thames and Trent basins, clusters of young adult male graves with traumatic injuries increase sharply. Osteological analysis shows repeated healed and fatal wounds consistent with organized conflict rather than sporadic raiding. These were not border skirmishes with external enemies. They reflect sustained inter-kingdom warfare within the developing Anglo-Saxon world itself. Consolidation had reached the stage where the primary threats to kings now came from rival kings. The political geography of Britain responded accordingly. Kingdoms expanded through conquest and absorption rather than mere kin expansion. Successful dynasties incorporated defeated communities into tributary structures while preserving local elites as subordinate rulers. This process is visible indirectly through sudden shifts in material culture across short territorial distances. Brooch forms, burial rites, and architectural styles change abruptly at some political boundaries, indicating forced realignment rather than gradual diffusion. Conquest left its signatures not in chronicles, which are absent, but in the stratigraphy of everyday life. At the same time, diplomacy matured alongside warfare. Marriage alliances between royal houses interconnected distant regions of the island. Genealogical traditions preserved in later sources suggest that these alliances reached across what would become Kent, East Anglia, Wessex, and Mercia. These unions were not merely domestic arrangements. They functioned as instruments of security and influence, binding retinues, redistributing land, and stabilizing frontiers for at least a generation. Political stability was achieved not through fixed borders, but through overlapping personal bonds. Trade revived at regional scale under these conditions of partial stabilization. Although long-distance Roman markets were gone, local and North Sea exchange intensified after 550 CE. Craft specialization expanded. Glass production centers appear in several inland locations, confirming domestic manufacture rather than exclusive reliance on imports. Iron tool assemblages diversify. Pottery production standardizes at regional level. These developments indicate a reintegration of economic life beyond household subsistence. Political order, however violent its formation, created the predictability required for craft investment and surplus circulation. Religious practice remained pagan throughout this phase, yet subtle changes unfolded in ritual expression. Cremation, dominant during the initial settlement phase, began to decline in many regions after 550 CE, replaced gradually by inhumation without grave goods. This transition was uneven and prolonged, but its beginnings suggest a reorientation of mortuary symbolism away from ostentatious display toward more restrained forms of commemoration. The change does not yet reflect Christian influence in any systematic sense. It reflects shifting social values within pagan frameworks as elite dominance became normalized rather than contested. The increasing permanence of political authority also altered how communities experience time. In earlier generations, leadership turnover and migration had compressed historical memory into short horizons of living ancestry. By the later 6th century, dynasties could point to multiple generations of rule over the same territory. Whole sites accumulated genealogical meaning through repeated habitation and burial. The past began to structure political legitimacy as a lineage narrative rather than merely an oral memory of personal deeds. History, in this limited but crucial sense, had begun to matter. Yet the system retained acute fragility. Succession crises remained endemic. Violent usurpation remained common. The absence of written law, centralized taxation, or standing bureaucracy meant that political order still depended on constant personal negotiation. The kings of this period ruled land and people, but they did not yet rule institutions independent of themselves. When the person failed, the structure failed with them. The enduring stability that would later characterize medieval monarchy had not yet emerged. By the close of the 6th century, Britain had therefore completed its transition from Roman province to Germanic political landscape, but not from volatility to permanence. The island was now a mosaic of rival pagan kingdoms bound by war, marriage, and trade, operating without reference to imperial authority or universal religion. The foundations of a new civilization were in place, yet its ideological and administrative framework remained unresolved. Into this unsettled world would soon arrive a force that restructured not only political allegiance, but the very grammar of authority itself. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity would not simply add a new belief system. It would remake law, kingship, literacy, and the relationship between earthly and sacred power. Between 500 and 650 CE, the political order of the Anglo-Saxon world remained inseparable from its religious structure. Kingship drew legitimacy not only from victory and lineage, but from the visible maintenance of harmony between human community and sacred landscape. The authority of rulers rested on their demonstrated capacity to secure fertility, enforce law, and prevail in war under the sanction of ancestral powers. This relationship between sovereignty and sacrality did not operate through institutional priesthoods or temples of stone. It was embedded in groves, rivers, burial grounds, and seasonal assemblies that bound political obligation to cosmological expectation. Power was experienced as something granted as much as seized. Archaeological distributions of ritual deposition between the late 5th and early 7th centuries reveal continuity with pre-migration Germanic practice alongside new territorial inflections. Weapon offerings in bogs and river crossings continue across multiple regions of eastern Britain throughout the early 6th century. The typology of these deposits, bent swords, broken spearheads, shield bosses deliberately perforated prior to deposition, demonstrates ceremonial neutralization of martial power rather than battlefield discard. Repetition at the same wetland sites across decades indicates inherited ritual geographies rather than spontaneous acts. These locations anchored political memory across generations. To rule land was also to inherit its sacred obligations. Kings performed these obligations publicly at assembly places situated near such liminal landscapes. Place name evidence preserves the locations of early meeting sites identifiable by elements associated with groves, stones, and fords. Legal authority issued not from enclosed administrative centers, but from open-air spaces charged with ritual meaning. Judgment, oath-taking, and tribute distribution occurred under the gaze of inherited sacred markers rather than behind palace walls. Law in this phase remained an extension of cosmological order rather than an autonomous institution. The social economy of kingship operated through feasting and gift circulation, bound tightly to religious expectation. Archaeological remains from elite halls dated between 520 and 600 CE show repeated large-scale animal slaughter events. Cattle dominate the faunal assemblages, followed by pig and sheep, indicating both pastoral wealth and seasonal scheduling aligned with ritual calendars. These feasts were not merely displays of wealth. They constituted acts of redistribution that reaffirmed loyalty under sacred sanction. To accept a king's gift was to bind oneself simultaneously to his political authority and to the cosmological order that legitimized it. Mortuary display during this period provides the clearest evidence of how sacred kingship was materially rehearsed. Elite burials dated between 550 and 625 CE incorporate symbolic objects whose meanings transcended individual biography. The Sutton Hoo Mound Cemetery in East Anglia, with its ship burial dated by coin evidence to the early 7th century, represents the apex of this tradition. The interment of a complete seagoing vessel, alongside regalia, helmets, shields, weapons, and imported silverware, constitutes a choreographed political theology expressed through material culture. The dead ruler is represented not merely as a warrior, but as the axis through which land, sea, and divine favor converge. Such burials were not reflections of afterlife belief alone. They were instruments addressed to the living political community. Yet even outside the rarefied sphere of regal burial, sacred kingship structured everyday life. Amulets, animal teeth, and symbolic pendants appear widely in both male and female graves throughout the 6th and early 7th centuries. These objects circulated across social strata, embedding individual identity within a shared cosmological grammar. Protection, fertility, and courage remain tangible forces accessed through material mediation. The supernatural operated not as an abstract doctrine, but as a practical dimension of survival. The political implications of this system were restrictive as well as enabling. Kingship, because it depended on sacred efficacy as well as military success, could be undermined not only by defeat, but by perceived ritual failure. Crop loss, epidemic disease, or military disaster could be interpreted as signs of withdrawn divine favor. Archaeological evidence of abandoned elite sites following catastrophic fire events in the later 6th century suggests that political authority could collapse rapidly once its ritual legitimacy was compromised. The king ruled at the mercy of forces he claimed to mediate. Across the emerging kingdoms, regional religious variation accompanied political differentiation. While core Germanic cosmology remained shared, local sacred geographies shaped distinct ritual economies. River-centered polities emphasized watery offering traditions. Upland kingdoms favored groves and ridge sanctuaries. These differences reinforced political fragmentation. Each kingdom possessed not only its own ruling dynasty, but its own sacred topography, binding community to territory through ritual precedent. At the same time, external ideological pressure began to accumulate at the margins of this pagan order. Frankish Gaul, long Christianized at elite level, maintained diplomatic and marital ties with Kent and parts of southeast Britain. Trade goods circulating through Kentish ports after 550 CE increasingly include explicitly Christian symbols, cross-marked brooches, inscribed vessels, and ecclesiastical metalwork. These objects entered pagan courts not as agents of conversion, but as prestige material embedded within existing gift economies. Their presence, however, introduced alternative models of sacred authority that would soon destabilize the cosmological monopoly of pagan kingship. For the moment, the old structures held. Kings continued to rule through ancestral invocation, ritual generosity, and martial command. Sacred landscapes continued to frame law, tribute, and legitimacy. The fusion of kingship and cosmology remained intact, across most of the Anglo-Saxon world. Yet beneath this apparent continuity, the ideological conditions that sustained it were already being quietly undermined by new forms of sacred power whose authority derived not from place or lineage, but from text, institution, and universal doctrine. By the early decades of the 7th century, the pagan structures that had long stabilized authority began to encounter sustained ideological competition that no earlier external contact had produced. The arrival of Christian missions did not merely introduce a new set of beliefs. It inserted a rival theory of power, one grounded not in landscape-bound ritual mediation, but in a universal sacred law administered by literate institutions. This confrontation unfolded unevenly across the kingdoms, but its political consequences would prove irreversible. The first durable point of entry occurred in Kent after 597 CE, when the mission led by Augustine arrived under the sponsorship of Pope Gregory. The success of this mission depended less on popular conversion than on royal calculation. Ethelbert of Kent, whose power rested partly on Frankish alliances through marriage to the Christian Princess Bertha, permitted the establishment of a Christian foothold without immediately abandoning pagan practice. Archaeological traces of early ecclesiastical structures at Canterbury date to the first decades of the 7th century and show adaptation of existing Roman buildings rather than new monumental construction. The old imperial ruins became the substrate of the new religious order. Christianity entered Britain not as a wilderness faith, but as an inheritor of Roman spatial memory. The political attractiveness of Christianity lay not in its theology alone, but in its administrative utility. Christian doctrine brought with it literacy, record-keeping, and a transregional clerical network capable of sustaining authority beyond the lifespan of any single ruler. For kings whose power still depended on personal loyalty and ritual prestige, this institutional durability offered a new technology of governance. Written law, fixed doctrine, and clerical mediation promised continuity, where pagan kingship offered only precarious succession. Material culture documents the early stages of this ideological bifurcation. Grave dated between 600 and 630 CE increasingly avert grave goods in regions influenced by Christian teaching, while neighboring territories retain fully equipped warrior burials. This divergence reflects not simply belief difference, but competing models of authority. In Christian-affiliated zones, legitimacy began to shift from visible material display toward invisible legal and doctrinal sanction. In pagan zones, authority remained performative and materially explicit. The conversion of East Anglia after approximately 630 CE and of Northumbria following the mission of Paulinus marks the acceleration of this process. Royal sponsorship again precedes mass conversion. Kings acted as conduits of ideological transformation because they alone possessed the power to redirect ritual economy at scale. Archaeologically, the shift is visible in the rapid establishment of monastic centers at sites strategically aligned with royal estates and trade routes. These were not isolated spiritual enclaves. They were administrative nodes through which land, labor, and ideological authority were reorganized. Yet conversion did not proceed as linear replacement. For several decades, syncretism defined religious practice. Christian symbols appear alongside traditional amulets. Churches rise near former sacred groves. Kings maintained multiple sources of sacral legitimacy during periods of political uncertainty, drawing on both ancestral ritual and Christian priestly sanction. This duality reflects a pragmatic rather than doctrinal approach to belief. Authority during this transitional phase was accumulative rather than exclusive. The political stakes of conversion were fully revealed in the conflict between rival royal houses aligned with different religious orientations. In Northumbria, successive kings alternated between pagan and Christian allegiance during the first half of the 7th century. Each reversal corresponded to shifts in external alliance and internal factional control. Military victory, not theological persuasion, determined the survival of religious orientation at court. The sacred was now openly entangled with geopolitics. Christian institutions, however, possessed a structural advantage that pagan kingship lacked. Monasteries accumulated land as inalienable property. Clerical estates were insulated from the cycles of confiscation and redistribution that characterized secular war. Over time, this produced an alternative concentration of wealth independent of royal gift economy. Political power began to bifurcate between military authority and ecclesiastical authority, a division unknown to earlier pagan systems. This altered the nature of kingship itself. A Christian king no longer claimed legitimacy primarily through ritual mediation with the land. He claimed it through divine law interpreted by clergy. Oath-taking shifted from sacred landscape to sacred text. Law ceased to be exclusively customary and began to be codified. Political memory shifted from oral genealogy to written record. Authority acquired temporal depth independent of individual charisma. The transformation also reshaped concepts of violence. Pagan warfare functioned within a ritualized framework of honor, retribution, and sacred offering. Christianity reframed violence as morally conditional rather than cosmologically inevitable. While warfare did not cease, its justification increasingly required clerical sanction and moral narrative rather than purely ancestral precedent. This ideological mutation would profoundly influence later state formation. By the middle of the 7th century, large portions of southern and eastern England had entered this dual sacral phase in which pagan kingship and Christian institution coexisted uneasily. The sacred landscape still anchored political memory, but written scripture now competed with Grove and Ford as the source of law. The king still held feast and tribute, but the bishop now advised on judgment. Authority was no longer unitary. It had become divided between sword and script. This division marked the beginning of the end for purely pagan kingship as a stable political form. The old system, rooted entirely in place, lineage, and ritual offering, could not compete indefinitely with a doctrine that transcended territory and encoded authority into durable text and translocal hierarchy. The sacred landscapes did not vanish, but their monopoly over political legitimacy was broken. The next stage of Saxon transformation would be defined by the full institutionalization of this new religious order and by the administrative revolution it enabled. By the final decades of the 7th century, Christianity had moved decisively beyond the status of a royal experiment and begun to function as an institutional framework for the reorganization of Anglo-Saxon society. What began in 597 CE as a mission tolerated by a single king in Kent had, by 700 CE, produced a network of bishoprics, monasteries, and clerical landholdings stretching from the Channel coast to the Northumbrian frontier. The transformation was not merely spiritual, it was administrative, legal, and informational. Christianity introduced a durable architecture of governance built not on lineage alone, but on text, office, and permanent record. Earliest visible change appears in the landscape of authority. Episcopal seats established at Canterbury, Rochester, London, York, and Lindisfarne after 600 CE became fixed centers of jurisdiction, unlike any that had existed under pagan rule. Archaeological excavations at Canterbury demonstrate continuous ecclesiastical occupation layered directly over late Roman foundations, with stone structures rebuilt and reoriented for Christian liturgy by the early 7th century. This spatial continuity mattered politically. Christian administration inherited the physical memory of imperial governance and translated it into a new institutional language. Monasteries multiplied rapidly after 630 CE, especially in regions under stable royal patronage. Sites such as Whitby, Weymouth, Jarrow, and Malmesbury did not function as isolated spiritual retreats. They were productive estates, scriptoria schools, and administrative hubs. Charters issued by kings donating land to religious houses, preserved in later copies, record the systematic transfer of agricultural resources to clerical control. This marked a structural shift in land tenure. For the first time, large tracts of land were removed from the cycle of royal redistribution and placed under theoretically perpetual institutional ownership. The economic consequences were immediate. Monastic estates became focal points of agricultural intensification. Grange systems expanded cereal production. Stock breeding stabilized around predictable ecclesiastical demand. Surplus flowed not into warrior feasting alone, but into manuscript production, building programs, and long-term storage. The political economy of the kingdom now rested partly on institutional accumulation rather than exclusively on personal gift exchange. Power acquired memory. Literacy functioned as the central transformative technology of this new order. Before conversion, law, lineage, and obligation persisted almost entirely through oral transmission. By the early 7th century, Latin literacy reintroduced writing as a tool of governance. The earliest Anglo-Saxon law code, issued by King Ethelbert of Kent between approximately 602 and 616 CE, survives in later manuscript tradition, but reflects this immediate administrative revolution. Its provisions regulate compensation, injury, theft, and social rank in precise monetary values. Law had become abstracted from personal mediation into fixed rule. The king no longer merely judged, he legislated. The material record confirms this textualization of authority. Stylus fragments, ink pots, and imported writing tablets appear at several ecclesiastical sites dated to the mid-7th century. Manuscript fragments recovered from waterlogged contexts demonstrate the adoption of parchment codices rather than scrolls. The technological shift carried ideological weight. Codified law implied permanence. Written record implied accountability beyond personal memory. Kings increasingly ruled not only through presence and force, but through documented command. The ecclesiastical hierarchy introduced a parallel chain of authority independent of warrior retinues. Bishops and abbots held court, regulated marriage, administered oaths, and mediated disputes. Their power did not depend on armed followers. It depended on sanctioned expertise in doctrine and text. This created a second locus of legitimacy within each kingdom. Political authority now occupied a dual vertical structure, one ascending through military loyalty, the other through clerical certification. This duality reshaped kingship from within. Christian kingship demanded new performances of legitimacy. Public baptism, church endowment, and protection of clergy became visible markers of righteous rule. Failure to uphold these obligations exposed a ruler not only to rebellion, but to spiritual condemnation articulated in literate form. Royal behavior entered the permanent record. Power acquired moral surveillance. Nowhere is this transformation clearer than in Northumbria during the reigns of Edwin, Oswald, and Oswiu between 616 and 670 CE. Each king's conversion corresponded to shifts in foreign alliance and internal factional power. After the Synod of Whitby in 664 CE, which aligned Northumbria with Roman rather than Irish Christian practice, ecclesiastical uniformity became an explicit political objective. Doctrine was no longer negotiable at royal discretion. It became a matter of institutional conformity extending beyond the kingdom itself. Material culture reflects this tightening integration. Grave goods diminish sharply across converted regions after 650 CE. Stone church construction increases. Inscribed grave markers replace furnished burials for elites. The political language of death shifts from martial display to spiritual affiliation. Legacy becomes textual rather than material. Memory migrates from mound to manuscript. The most profound consequence of this shift was the creation of historical consciousness. Monastic centers cultivated annals, genealogies, and narrative histories. By 731 CE, Bede completed his ecclesiastical history of the English people, a work unimaginable under pagan kingship. This text did not merely describe history, it produced it as a coherent sequence of divine-guided transformation. The past was now interpretable as a continuous narrative rather than a collection of ancestral episodes. Time itself became administrable. This recalibration of time, law, land, and authority marked the definitive birth of the Anglo-Saxon administrative world. The old sacred landscapes had not vanished, but their political monopoly had ended. Power now operated simultaneously through sword, charter, altar, and script. The Saxon world had entered the age of institution. By the early 8th century, the institutionalization of Christianity had reached a level of density sufficient to reshape not only governance, but but cognition itself. Monasteries now functioned as the primary engines of knowledge production and transmission. At Weymouth, Jarrow, founded between 674 and 681 CE, under the patronage of Benedict Biscop, purpose-built stone churches, glass workshops, and libraries imported directly from the continent created an unprecedented concentration of learned infrastructure in Northern Europe. Excavations confirm the presence of continental glass, Mediterranean pigments, and imported parchment, material evidence of sustained intellectual exchange with Rome and Gaul. The Anglo-Saxon world, once oriented primarily toward kin and landscape, now participated in a transregional economy of texts. This expansion of literacy altered administrative practice at every level. Royal charters granting land to ecclesiastical foundations multiplied after 680 CE, and with them emerged standardized formulae of legal language. Boundary clauses within these documents describe landscapes with exceptional precision, naming rivers, stones, ridges, and woodland edges in fixed textual form. Space itself was being abstracted into legal record. Disputes over land increasingly required documentary resolution rather than oral testimony alone. Authority thus acquired a documentary backbone that endured beyond the presence of any single ruler. The law followed the same trajectory. After Ethelbert's early code, successive kings issued increasingly sophisticated bodies of legislation. The laws of Eclothar and Edric of Kent, dated to the late 7th century, address procedural justice, theft, and the authority of royal courts in ways that assume institutional continuity rather than episodic judgment. By the reign of Ine of Wessex in the early 8th century, law codes regulate not only personal injury but agricultural obligation, military service, and ecclesiastical privilege. The king's word had become structurally embedded in written norm. Governance moved from charismatic arbitration toward rule-based administration. The army, too, reflected this institutional turn. Military obligation, once tied chiefly to personal loyalty and plunder expectation, became increasingly defined as a legal duty owed by landholders. The provision of men, equipment, and provisions for royal campaigns appears explicitly in later law codes whose structural roots reach into this period. Warfare remained personal in its execution, but bureaucratic in its extraction. Kings no longer depended solely on consensual warbands. They could compel service through enforceable legal mechanisms. Ecclesiastical influence penetrated this militarized order without abolishing it. Clerical exemption from military service and taxation created new social gradients within the kingdom. Church estates functioned as protected economic reservoirs, less exposed to the volatility of war and succession. This predictability encouraged long-term investment in drainage, milling, and livestock improvement. Water mills, archaeologically attested from the late 7th and early 8th centuries, appear disproportionately on monastic land. These installations mark the first systematic application of mechanical power in post-Roman Britain. Institutional stability translated directly into technological uptake. The cultural effects of literacy spread outward from monastic cores into royal households and elite society. Young aristocrats trained in reading and Latin grammar served as administrative intermediaries between king and clergy. Bilingualism in Old English and Latin became a marker of elite status. Written correspondence connected Anglo-Saxon rulers with the papal court and with Frankish kings. Diplomatic activity widened in both geographical scope and procedural sophistication. Political isolation, once enforced by maritime distance, receded under the pressure of script. This integration into the Latin Christian world reoriented external relations as well as internal structure. Alliances, once sealed primarily through marriage and hostage exchange, increasingly incorporated ecclesiastical mediation. Bishops functioned as diplomatic brokers. Papal letters intervened in dynastic disputes. The Saxon kingdoms were no longer insulated subsystems. They had become nodes within a wider ideological and political network that transcended the North Sea. Yet the process was neither smooth nor uniform. Pagan practice persisted at local scale well into the 8th century, especially in upland and frontier zones. Burial customs, seasonal festivals, and vernacular ritual continued alongside Christian rites in many communities. The old sacred landscapes did not disappear. They were reinterpreted, sometimes quietly absorbed into Christian topography through the placement of churches near long-venerated sites. The ideological revolution advanced not by erasure, but by gradual overlay. The decisive change lay in how authority was now stabilized across time. Under pagan kingship, continuity depended on memory, lineage, and constant demonstration of force. Under Christian institutional order, continuity depended on archives, property law, and clerical succession systems independent of bloodline. Power ceased to reset completely with each dynastic crisis. Structures endured beyond rulers. The kingdom became conceptually separable from the king. By the time Bede completed his history in 731 CE, this separation had already transformed how the Saxon world understood itself. He wrote not as a genealogist of warbands, but as a chronicler of a people progressing through time under divine order. The Anglo-Saxons now possessed not only a political identity, but a recorded past and an anticipated future. The conversion had not ended conflict. It had reorganized it within a new grammar of authority whose consequences would shape every later phase of Saxon power. The institutional scaffold erected in this period would soon be tested by a force that operated neither through kin nor through church, but through sudden, external shock. In the summer of 793 CE, longships cut across the North Sea and made landfall on the island of Lindisfarne off the Northumbrian coast. The monastery there, founded little more than a century earlier as a center of Christian learning and royal patronage, was stripped of its treasures and its community scattered or killed. Alcuin of York, writing from the Carolingian court soon after, described the event as an assault without precedent in living memory. Archaeology confirms the shock was not symbolic alone. Destruction, layers, and abandoned occupation, horizons at coastal monastic sites across Northumbria and eastern Britain appear within the same narrow chronological band. The institutional order built over 2 centuries of conversion and administration had encountered a form of maritime violence more concentrated and more persistent than any Saxon raid of the Roman era. The Scandinavian incursions did not begin as conquest. They began as reconnaissance and extraction. Early raids between 793 and 830 CE targeted monasteries, river mouths, and exposed estates rich in movable wealth. Silver, relics, livestock, and captives were removed with speed and minimal territorial ambition. Coin hoards buried during this period cluster in ecclesiastical zones rather than along political boundaries, demonstrating that the attackers aimed at liquidity rather than land. The raids exploited precisely the institutional consolidation that Christian kingship had produced. Monasteries concentrated wealth and were predictable targets. Administrative success created strategic vulnerability. The Saxon response during these first decades was fragmented. Royal armies remained structured for land-based conflict between neighboring kingdoms rather than for rapid coastal interception. Naval capacity was minimal. Fortifications faced inland rivals, not maritime shock. Royal annals record repeated coastal alarms, but coordinated countermeasures lagged behind the speed and unpredictability of Scandinavian sea power. The Anglo-Saxon political order, optimized for territorial administration and dynastic rivalry, proved slow to adapt to a highly mobile external threat. By the middle of the 9th century, the character of Scandinavian involvement shifted from raiding to occupation. In 865 CE, a large composite force known in later sources as the Great Heathen Army landed in eastern England. Unlike earlier bands, this force did not withdraw seasonally. It overwintered, fortified positions, and campaigned year after year. Archaeological excavation at Repton in Derbyshire reveals a winter base dated to 873–874 CE, containing mass burials, dismantled buildings, and Scandinavian weapon assemblages. These remains demonstrate sustained military presence rather than episodic incursion. The logic of violence had crossed from extraction to spatial control. Political impact was immediate and catastrophic for several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria collapsed in 867 CE after the fall of York. East Anglia followed in 869–870 CE. Archaeological horizons in both regions show rapid disruption of elite sites and redistribution of landholding. Coinage struck under Scandinavian authority replaces indigenous royal currency within a single generation in occupied zones. The institutional map of Saxon power was being erased region by region. Only Wessex remained unconquered. Its survival rested on the political and administrative transformations achieved during the preceding Christian centuries. The West Saxon kings commanded more cohesive legal authority, more predictable military obligation, and denser networks of defended urban sites than their northern counterparts. Alfred, who came to the throne in 871 CE amid near-continuous campaigning, inherited a kingdom already oriented toward institutional defense rather than aristocratic rivalry. This inheritance proved decisive. Between 871 and 878 CE, Wessex stood at the brink of collapse. Scandinavian forces penetrated deep into its interior. Royal armies were repeatedly defeated. Alfred himself entered a period of strategic withdrawal in the marshlands of Somerset in early 878 CE. Yet the administrative depth of Wessex allowed persistence beneath military defeat. Food rents continued to flow. Legal authority endured in dispersed form. Local fortifications functioned independently of central command. The institutional skeleton of the kingdom held even as its military musculature failed. The counteroffensive that followed in the spring of 878 CE culminated in the Battle of Edington. Scandinavian forces were defeated and forced into negotiation. The subsequent Treaty of Wedmore formalized a territorial division between Wessex and the Scandinavian-controlled Danelaw. This treaty did not end conflict permanently, but it stabilized political geography for the first time since 865 CE. The Anglo-Saxon world had survived not by defeating the Scandinavian system outright, but by adapting its own institutional order to coexist with it. The Viking disruption thus exposed both the vulnerability and the resilience of Saxon civilization. The kingdoms that remained rooted in fragmented dynastic rivalry collapsed rapidly. The kingdom that had most fully internalized institutional governance endured. The conversion to Christianity, the rise of law code, and the creation of territorial administration now revealed their strategic value under existential pressure. The sword alone had not saved Wessex. The record, the rent, and the fortification had. The balance of power in Britain had now been permanently altered. A foreign military and legal order coexisted with the Saxon one across wide territories. The question that now governed the future of England was no longer whether Saxon power could survive, but whether it could expand again under these radically new conditions. The coexistence imposed by the Treaty of Wedmore did not represent equilibrium in the modern sense. It marked the beginning of a new phase of structural competition between two systems of rule occupying the same island under radically different legal and economic assumptions. The Danelaw, extending across much of eastern and northern England, operated on Scandinavian legal custom, distinct land tenure, and a warrior economy oriented towards silver rather than agrarian rent. The surviving Saxon kingdom in Wessex, by contrast, derived its strength from institutional continuity, written law, and the capacity to mobilize fixed territorial resources. What followed after 878 CE was not simply a military standoff. It was a contest of state forms. Archaeological settlement patterns within the Danelaw reveal rapid Scandinavian reorganization. Nucleated villages surrounded by open field systems appear in regions previously characterized by dispersed Saxon farmsteads. Place name evidence, based on Scandinavian linguistic roots, concentrates heavily in these zones, confirming large-scale demographic implantation rather than thin elite dominance. The introduction of standardized weights, silver-based exchange, and long-distance trading towns, such as York, transformed the eastern economy into a hybrid of agrarian production and maritime commerce. The former Saxon institutional landscape was not merely conquered, it was structurally repurposed. In this environment, Wessex initiated the most far-reaching military and administrative reforms in post-Roman British history. Alfred's program after 878 CE reshaped defense not as episodic mobilization, but as permanent territorial infrastructure. A coordinated network of fortified settlements, later known as the Burh system, was constructed across Wessex at strategic intervals. Archaeological measurement of Burh spacing confirms that no rural population center lay more than a day's march from a defended refuge. These installations were not temporary strongholds. They were permanent administrative nodes combining military defense, market regulation, and legal authority. The financial logic of this system depended on the very institutional order introduced by Christianity 2 centuries earlier. The maintenance of burhs required consistent taxation in kind and labor service, legally enforceable through royal code. Alfred's Law Code, issued in the late 880s CE, explicitly integrates Christian moral doctrine with secular legal obligation, linking theft, oath-breaking, and military failure to divine sanction. Law, defense, and faith were now fused into a single operational grammar of rule. The kingdom had become a defensive machine powered by institutional continuity rather than aristocratic loyalty alone. The navy, long absent as a formal instrument of Saxon power, emerged as a strategic necessity under this new logic. Shipbuilding programs initiated under Alfred introduced larger, more stable vessels designed to counter Scandinavian maneuverability. Although maritime supremacy remained contested, archaeological evidence from river obstacles and fortified river mouths indicates systematic attempts to deny Scandinavian fleets inland access. The defensive perimeter of Wessex expanded outward from land to water. Control of movement, rather than control of territory alone, became the central strategic objective. The socio-political consequences of this reorganization were immediate. Local aristocracies lost a degree of autonomous military authority as defense and taxation centralized under royal command. The warrior retinue, once attached primarily to personal lordship, increasingly integrated into a territorial army with prescribed service obligations. Military identity shifted from household to kingdom. Loyalty became juridical rather than exclusively personal. Meanwhile, within the Danelaw, Scandinavian rule underwent its own transformation. The raiding economy that had sustained early occupation gradually integrated into local agrarian production. Scandinavian leaders adopted elements of Saxon administrative practice where it facilitated stability and extraction. Law codes issued later in the century reveal hybrid legal forms combining Norse custom with existing English frameworks. Cultural collision produced institutional synthesis rather than simple replacement. The frontier did not freeze into two fixed worlds. It became a zone of mutual adaptation. The balance achieved by the late 9th century was therefore dynamic rather than static. Wessex survived because it transformed structurally rather than relying on inherited modes of kingship. The Scandinavian territories stabilized because they ceased to function solely as predatory systems. Each side modified its political architecture under pressure from the other. The island entered an era defined not by binary conquest, but by institutional convergence driven through conflict. This convergence would shape the next century of English history more deeply than any single battle. The resilience of Saxon power after 878 CE did not lie in military genius alone. It lay in the absorption of shock into an already mature administrative organism capable of reconfiguring itself under stress. The older world of episodic warfare and heroic kingship had finally yielded to the age of statecraft. The question that now governed the future was not whether Scandinavian power could be contained, but whether the Saxon political system could extend its institutional reach back across the territories it had lost. The recovery of lost territory began not as a rapid reconquest, but as a careful expansion of institutional gravity beyond the borders of Wessex. Alfred's reforms created a political engine capable of projecting stability outward in measured increments. His son, Edward the Elder, who came to the throne in 899 CE, inherited not merely a defended kingdom, but a mobile administrative framework designed for territorial absorption. The logic of expansion now rested less on decisive battles, and more on the sequential construction of fortified nodes that converted contested space into governable space. Between 910 and 924 CE, Edward and his sister Ethelfled, ruler of Mercia after 911 CE, advanced the Burr system steadily into former Danelaw territory. Fortified towns arose at strategic river crossings and road junctions, locations such as Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick, and Nottingham. Archaeological dating of rampart construction at these sites confirms rapid development phases tightly clustered within this period. Each new burh functioned simultaneously as military stronghold, administrative court, taxation center, and market. Conquest no longer meant the destruction of rivals alone. It meant the implantation of a parallel state infrastructure that absorbed local populations into a new legal and economic order. The Scandinavian political leadership within the Danelaw responded unevenly to this pressure. Some warlords resisted militarily and were eliminated. Others entered into negotiated submission in exchange for land retention and legal recognition. This process is visible in later documentary traditions that record Scandinavian origin elites as landholders under West Saxon sovereignty. The manner of incorporation reveals the institutional confidence of the expanding Saxon state. It did not require ethnic replacement, it required jurisdiction. Law functioned as the principal instrument of this absorption. Revised legal codes under Edward integrated Scandinavian legal concepts while subordinating them to royal authority. Blood compensation systems were standardized. Market regulation intensified. Toll and mint control shifted into royal hands. Coinage provides the most precise material indicator of this transformation. Mints established within former Danelaw territories after 910 CE issued uniform royal coin, types identical in weight and iconography to those of Wessex. Monetary control, once fragmented along cultural lines, became territorially unified under a single issuing authority. Urban revival followed fortification. Scandinavian trading centers such as York, Lincoln, and Derby, once oriented toward the North Sea silver economy, increasingly integrated into a kingdom-wide fiscal network based on land rent and regulated market exchange. Excavations at York reveal a gradual shift from predominantly imported goods toward increased local craft production after the West Saxon absorption. The trading world of the eastern towns did not disappear. It was subordinated to royal regulation. Market activity ceased to be independent power and became taxable power. The ideological dimension of this territorial re-expansion proved as critical as the administrative and military dimensions. Christianity provided a unifying grammar capable of superseding both older Saxon pagan tradition and Scandinavian religious practice. Church foundations accompanied military advance. New bishoprics and monastic estates appeared in recovered territories within a generation of political absorption. Baptism of Scandinavian elites occurred alongside oath-taking of fealty. Conversion followed power, but it also stabilized it. The Christian Church offered a trans-ethnic institutional matrix more durable than either Saxon lineage or Norse kinship. The maximum expression of this reconsolidated authority occurred under Ethelstan, grandson of Alfred, who took the throne in 924 CE and completed the territorial unification of England by 927 CE. His takeover of York eliminated the last independent Scandinavian kingship within Britain. For the first time since the Roman withdrawal, the island south of the Forth was governed under a single ruler. Yet the character of this unity differed fundamentally from that of Roman provincial administration. It was not imposed from a distant imperial core. It was woven through fortress, law code, coinage, and church into the daily economic life of the population. The Viking disruption, therefore, did not simply threaten Saxon civilization. It forced its radical maturation. The mechanisms forged in response to Scandinavian pressure, fortified urbanism, standing military obligation, codified law, monetary unification, and church-state integration, created the structural basis of the medieval English state. What had begun as emergency adaptation to external shock became the permanent architecture of governance. Scandinavian power did not vanish without trace. It altered the genetic, linguistic, and cultural composition of large regions of England. Norse loanwords entered Old English. Legal customs persisted under royal sanction. Urban commercial rhythms in York and the East Midlands retained Scandinavian inflections for centuries. The Viking presence became part of the substrate upon which later English identity formed. Conflict produced synthesis rather than simple displacement. By the later decades of the 10th century, the Saxon world had emerged from the age of raiders, transformed into a territorially consolidated kingdom. The era of scattered, rival polities had ended. A singular political organism now governed the island's core. Yet the system that had defeated one Scandinavian wave would soon confront another, far more systematic in its ambition and far more dangerous in its political implications. The unification of England after the Viking Wars was not the product of a single reign, but the cumulative outcome of institutional momentum generated across 4 generations of West Saxon rulers. The decisive break occurred after 878 CE, when the Treaty of Wedmore stabilized the political frontier between Wessex and the Scandinavian Danelaw. From that moment forward, expansion proceeded not as opportunistic warfare, but as the methodical extension of administrative control. The kingdom that emerged between the late 9th and early 11th centuries was neither tribal nor imperial in the Roman sense. It was the first durable territorial state ever formed on English soil. Alfred of Wessex, who reigned from 871 to 899 CE, established the structural template. After 878 CE, he reorganized military defense into a rotating system of service that ensured permanent readiness without exhausting agrarian labor. This was reinforced by the construction of more than 30 burhs between 879 and 899 CE. These fortified towns were spaced at intervals of approximately 30 kilometers, determined by the distance a man could march in a day. Excavations at Winchester, Wallingford, Wareham, and Cricklade show continuous urban occupation beginning precisely in this interval. Each burh functioned as a garrison, a legal court, a taxation center, and a market. For the first time since Rome, English territory was governed through a permanent grid of fortified administration. Alfred also reoriented the ideological foundations of kingship. His law code, issued around 890 CE, explicitly fused Mosaic law, Christian ethics, and inherited Germanic custom into a single juridical framework. This was not symbolic theology. It constituted the ideological claim that royal command operated under written divine law rather than ancestral ritual alone. Kingship had become constitutional in principle, if not yet in modern practice. Royal authority now claimed permanence beyond biological succession. The true expansion, however, unfolded under Edward the Elder, who ruled from 899 to 924 CE. Between 910 and 924 CE, Edward and his sister Ethelfled of Mercia dismantled the political infrastructure of the Danelaw through the progressive implantation of burhs into Danish-held territory. Fortresses at Hertford, 912, Witham, 913, Buckingham, 914, Bedford, 914, and Towcester, 917, advanced royal jurisdiction west to east with mathematical regularity. Archaeological layers at these sites show abrupt urbanization directly coinciding with known construction years preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Each fortress erased an existing Scandinavian power center not by destruction alone, but by administrative overwriting. The military conquest of the Danelaw reached culmination in 918–919 CE with the submission of Danish-held Leicester and the political realignment of York. By the time Edward died in 924 CE, the English kingdom already extended from the Channel to the Humber. The incorporation of former Scandinavian elites followed rapidly. These men were not eliminated wholesale. They were absorbed as royal landholders under English law. Wergild values, military obligation, and market tolls were standardized across former ethnic boundaries. Jurisdiction replaced ethnicity as the organizing principle of political identity. Edward's son Ethelstan, crowned in 924 CE and ruling until 939 CE, completed the territorial unification of England as a single kingship. In 927 CE, He expelled the last independent Scandinavian king from York and received the submission of rulers from Scotland, Strathclyde, and Wales. This moment marked the first time the title King of all the English, Rex Totius Britanniae in some charters, corresponded to administrative reality. Coinage issued under Ethelstan after 927 CE displays a unified royal portrait across all major mints, London, Winchester, York, Lincoln, and Exeter, attesting to direct monetary control over the entire realm. Ethelstan's reign formalized the bureaucratic character of kingship. His law codes, issued between 928 and 935 CE, presuppose a fully functioning system of royal officials, local courts, standardized penalties, and compulsory military service. Market regulation is specified down to weights and measures. Counterfeiting becomes a capital crime. Land tenure is defined through written charter rather than oral reputation. These provisions reflect not aspirational claims, but operating governance. Archaeological evidence from regulated market layers in Winchester and York confirms standardized weights and coin circulation corresponding precisely to this period. The Battle of Brunanburh in 937 CE illustrates the geopolitical maturity of the new English kingdom. Ethelstan and his brother Edmund faced a coalition of Norse Gaels from Dublin, Scots from Alba, and Britons of Strathclyde. The battle, whose precise location remains debated, ended in decisive English victory. Contemporary poetic sources frame the conflict as the defense of a unified realm rather than the survival of a single dynasty. The battlefield thus functioned as a symbolic ratification of unification achieved administratively in the preceding decade. After Ethelstan's death in 939 CE, the kingdom briefly fractured when Scandinavian rulers reclaimed York, yet the institutional machine endured. Edmund IR 939-946 and Edred R 946-955 reconquered the north by 954 CE, permanently eliminating independent Scandinavian kingship within England. The very speed of this reconsolidation demonstrates the transformation that had taken place since the 860s. Territorial loss no longer unraveled the kingdom, it paused it. By the reign of Edgar, 959-975 CE, English kingship entered its phase of highest internal stability. Edgar presided over a realm secure at its borders and coherent within its administration. His coronation at Bath in 973 CE was choreographed as a ritual of peninsular sovereignty, borrowing deliberately from Roman imperial symbolism. Coinage reform under Edgar standardized silver pennies across the kingdom with remarkable uniformity. Mint output multiplied while weight standards converged. The English monetary system became one of the most stable in early medieval Europe. The social order was now fully territorial. The shire system, rooted in West Saxon administration, extended across the entire realm. Each shire operated under a royal reeve responsible for taxation, law enforcement, and military levy. Hundreds, subdivisions of the shire served as the basic units of legal assembly and fiscal extraction. These were not tribal districts. They were bureaucratic geometries imposed upon previously kin-based landscapes. Power had been abstracted into permanent structure. Yet this maturity also created new vulnerabilities. The concentration of wealth, silver, and written administration made England once again an attractive target for renewed Scandinavian ambition. By the final decades of the 10th century, raiders returned not as scattered warbands, but as emissaries of organized royal power from Denmark and Norway. The very success of English unification now advertised the scale of reward available to external conquerors. In 975 CE, England stood as a centralized Christian monarchy with codified law, unified currency, fortified urbanism, and territorial taxation, an institutional achievement unmatched in the post-Roman West. It had survived pagan migration and Viking conquest to become a coherent state. Yet history had not exhausted its cycles of disruption. The next Scandinavian wave would not aim merely to raid or settle. It would aim to rule England as its core possession. By the opening decades of the 11th century, England stood as the most administratively advanced kingdom in Northern Europe. Its territorial unity, monetary stability, and legal coherence far exceeded those of any neighboring realm. Yet these very achievements created systemic vulnerabilities. The concentration of silver, the predictability of taxation, and the transparency of administration rendered the kingdom both wealthy and legible to foreign powers. England had become not merely a target, but a prize whose seizure promised immediate fiscal reward and durable political control. The renewed Scandinavian assault that culminated in the Danish conquest of 1016 CE was fundamentally different from the Viking disruptions of the 9th century. This invasion was not driven by decentralized warbands, but by a consolidated royal power centered in Denmark. Signut, son of King Sweyn Forkbeard, commanded a professionalized army sustained by tributary systems extending across the North Sea world. The invasion of England in 1016 CE was therefore a state-level operation aimed at permanent dominion rather than episodic extraction. The collapse of English resistance unfolded with striking speed. King Ethelred II, who had ruled intermittently since 978 CE, presided over a polity weakened not by administrative decay, but by elite fragmentation. Despite the kingdom's formidable institutional machinery, its leadership was deeply divided along regional and familial lines. The repeated payments of tribute, known as Danegeld, during the 990s and early 1000s drained fiscal reserves without securing lasting peace. Coin hoards buried during these decades reveal escalating emergency taxation coupled with growing public insecurity. The kingdom could levy immense wealth, but it could not convert that wealth into strategic cohesion. Sweyn's invasion in 1013 CE forced Ethelred into exile, though Sweyn's sudden death in 1014 allowed temporary English recovery under Ethelred's reinstated rule. This interlude exposed the structural dilemma of late Saxon kingship. The administrative system could restore order with remarkable speed once immediate pressure lifted, yet it lacked the unified political will needed to resist prolonged assault. When Signut renewed the campaign in 1015 CE, English resistance fragmented again along regional lines. Battles at Asandun in 1016 CE broke the last coordinated field army of the Old West Saxon order. Signut's accession in 1016 CE inaugurated a rule that preserved almost the entire English administrative structure while replacing its dynastic core. The Danish king governed through existing shires, reeves, and law courts rather than dismantling them. Coinage continued to be struck without interruption, bearing Signut's image atop familiar monetary standards. Land grants to Danish followers were enacted through the same documentary processes that had served earlier Saxon kings. The transition of power occurred not through institutional rupture, but through elite replacement at its apex. This continuity is archaeologically visible in the absence of widespread settlement disruption after 1016 CE. Urban layers show no mass destruction corresponding to conquest. Rural agricultural patterns persist uninterrupted. The conquest was political rather than demographic. England's state apparatus proved robust enough to be captured intact by an external dynasty rather than destroyed. The Saxon political legacy thus survived even as Saxon royal bloodlines did not. Signut's reign from 1016 to 1035 CE represents a brief apex of North Sea imperial integration. His empire encompassed England, Denmark, Norway, and portions of southern Sweden. Yet even at its height, this empire functioned less as a centralized transmarine state than as a personal union maintained by military force and tribute. England remained its fiscal core. Silver extracted through English taxation financed continental rule. The administrative efficiency of the Saxon state thus underwrote its own subordination to a foreign dynasty. After Signut's death in 1035 CE, the North Sea Empire fragmented rapidly. His sons Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut ruled England in uneasy succession amid political instability and heavy taxation. Harthacnut's reign in particular intensified fiscal extraction to rebuild Danish fleets. Coinage output surged, while public confidence eroded. The strain on the landed elite deepened, leaving the kingdom politically exhausted by the early 1040s. In 1042 CE, the Saxon royal line returned to power with the accession of Edward the Confessor. His reign restored native kingship but not the older equilibrium. Edward governed an England whose fiscal mechanisms were intact, but whose aristocracy had grown entrenched, territorial, and increasingly autonomous. The great earldoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, commanded military and economic resources rivaling those of the crown itself. Royal power rested on negotiation rather than command. The king ruled through magnates who no longer depended solely on royal favor for their status. Edward's lack of a direct heir transformed succession from a dynastic certainty into a geopolitical contest. Throughout the 1050s and early 1060s, England's political horizon widened again beyond the island. Scandinavian claimants asserted inherited rights through Cnut's lineage. Norman dukes advanced claims through marriage ties. Internal English factions aligned themselves strategically with external contenders. The kingdom's very openness to diplomatic linkage now became a vulnerability. The Godwin family exemplified this new aristocratic dominance. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, and later his sons controlled the wealthiest and most densely populated region of the kingdom. Their military resources rivaled those of the crown. Harold Godwinson, who would later ascend the throne, emerged not from royal lineage, but from this magnate class. His eventual kingship would represent not the restoration of ancient Saxon monarchy, but its transformation into aristocratic election grounded in military support. The administrative perfection achieved under Ethelstan and Edgar thus entered its final phase of paradox. The stronger the institutions became, the more they enabled challenges to the crown by magnates who now operated within the same legal and fiscal system as the king. Power ceased to be monopolized at the apex. It diffused into the territorial elite. The kingdom functioned efficiently, yet its political cohesion weakened. By the early 1060s, England was institutionally rich but strategically exposed. It possessed abundant wealth, centralized taxation, regulated markets, and a disciplined militia. Yet its ruling class was internally divided, its king was aging without an heir, and its geopolitical profile invited intervention from multiple foreign powers. The English state had never been more logically constructed. It had rarely been more politically precarious. The final test of the Saxon world would not come from the administrative breakdown that had undone Roman Britain, but from the collision between a perfected territorial state and two external powers prepared to seize it by force. The crisis of 1066 unfolded not as a sudden catastrophe, but as the final convergence of long-accumulated structural pressures. On 5 January 1066, King Edward the Confessor died in Westminster without a direct heir. The mechanisms of succession that had stabilized earlier centuries now operated under unprecedented strain. England possessed no universally recognized principle of hereditary transmission. Kingship rested on election by the Witan, supported by aristocratic consensus and military capability. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in the realm and brother-in-law to the late king, was proclaimed king on 6 January 1066. His accession was administratively legal and militarily credible, yet it was not geopolitically secure. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy asserted a rival claim, grounded in earlier diplomatic assurances and reinforced by kinship through Edward's Norman connections. To the north, Harald Hardrada of Norway advanced a third claim, rooted in Scandinavian succession arrangements dating back to the reign of Cnut. England now faced not a diffuse frontier threat, but two fully organized external powers prepared to wage state-level invasion. The contest for the Saxon crown had become an international war. The military burden imposed on Harold's government was immediate and total. The English defensive system remained territorially coherent, but it was optimized for internal mobilization rather than for repelling simultaneous multidirectional invasion. The Fyrd, England's territorial militia, depended on seasonal agricultural cycles. Prolonged campaigning strained subsistence at local level. The fleet assembled along the south coast in the summer of 1066 consumed enormous resources and disbanded in early September when provisions expired. The vulnerability was logistical rather than tactical. The system that had resisted Viking fleets under Alfred was never designed to sustain continuous national mobilization, across multiple fronts. Hardrada struck first. In September 1066, the Norwegian army landed in the north with the support of Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the English king. On 20 September, the English earls Edwin and Morcar were defeated at Fulford Gate near York. 5 days later, Harold Godwinson conducted one of the most extraordinary forced marches in medieval history, covering nearly 300 kilometers in less than 2 weeks to confront the northern invaders. At Stamford Bridge, on 25 September 1066, the Norwegian army was annihilated. Hardrada was killed. Tostig fell with him. The Scandinavian claim to England collapsed in a single afternoon. Strategically, the victory was absolute. Structurally, it was ruinous. The king's army was depleted, its best troops exhausted, and its southern defenses exposed at the precise moment when the Norman invasion was imminent. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, on 28 September 1066, William of Normandy landed at Pevensey with a fully equipped combined arms force of cavalry, infantry, and archers. The Norman host represented a different military ecology from anything England had previously faced. It was not a militia army called up by legal duty. It was a professional expeditionary force held together by feudal obligation and contractual service. Harold immediately redeployed south. The speed of this redeployment further reduced the coherence of English forces. The Fyrd was reassembled hastily. Regional contingents arrived unevenly. The elite housecarls remained disciplined, but broader militia integration was incomplete. On 14 October 1066, the two armies met at Hastings. Archaeology offers little direct evidence of the battle itself, yet the convergence of textual accounts allows reconstruction of its decisive structural features. English infantry formed a dense shield wall on the ridge. Norman forces deployed in combined arms formation, using missile fire and cavalry shock in coordinated cycles. The battle was not decided quickly. It unfolded over the course of an entire day. Repeated Norman assaults broke against the English line without immediate success. It was only through the progressive erosion of English cohesion, by tactical feigned retreats, by cumulative fatigue, and finally by the death of the king, that the balance shifted irreversibly. Harold's death late in the day annihilated the symbolic and operational center of English resistance. The shield wall collapsed. The army disintegrated. The battlefield became the hinge on which 5 centuries of Saxon political development turned. The collapse of field resistance did not immediately dissolve English administration. For several months after Hastings, regional authorities continued to function. London defied William's initial approach. The archbishops and leading magnates deliberated in familiar institutional forms. It was not battle alone that delivered the kingdom to Norman control. It was the calculated substitution of elite leadership within an intact administrative framework. William's coronation on 25 December 1066 in Westminster Abbey symbolized this transfer. The ceremony followed English royal custom within a building that embodied both Roman and Saxon sacred memory. The conqueror positioned himself not as an external destroyer of institutions, but as their legitimate inheritor. The continuity was deliberate. England was not reduced to a province. It was captured as a working state. The transformation that followed was therefore not primarily military. It was administrative and social. Between 1066 and 1086, almost the entire landed elite of England was replaced. Saxon earls vanished from the highest ranks of power within 1 generation. Norman lords received their estates through royal charter under English law. The mechanisms of tenure, taxation, and jurisdiction persisted. The personnel changed. The Domesday Survey of 1086 provides the clearest quantitative evidence of this transfer. Where thousands of English thanes held land in 1066, only a handful still did so 20 years later. The political class of Saxon England had been extinguished without institutional collapse. Castles reshaped the landscape with unprecedented speed. These were not communal fortifications like the burghs. They were private instruments of domination. Motte and Bailey structures appeared in every major urban and rural center within a decade. Archaeological stratigraphy consistently places their earliest timber phases in the late 1060s and 1070s. These fortresses existed not to repel foreign invasion, but to enforce internal subjugation. They marked the replacement of territorial kingship with feudal hierarchy grounded in coercive lordship. Church reform proceeded in parallel. Norman bishops replaced English prelates. Episcopal sees were relocated from rural monasteries to fortified urban centers. Latin liturgical conformity tightened. The English Church was absorbed into the continental clerical order with little regard for earlier Saxon autonomy. Monastic libraries survived. Clerical landholding endured. Yet the English ecclesiastical elite was almost entirely displaced at the top. Sacred continuity persisted beneath institutional replacement. The administrative system of Saxon England survived conquest because it was too efficient to discard. Shires, hundreds, and royal courts remained functional. Taxation continued without interruption. The Geld remained the backbone of royal finance. What changed was the direction of extraction. Fiscal surplus now flowed into Norman continental networks rather than into English dynastic maintenance. The machinery built by Alfred and Ethelstan now financed the consolidation of a foreign aristocracy. Language registered this transition with particular precision. Old English remained the spoken language of the population. Norman French became the language of the ruling class. Latin remained the language of administration and record. Trilingual governance institutionalized social stratification along linguistic lines. For the first time since Roman withdrawal, English society possessed a ruling elite linguistically distinct from the majority of its population. Identity fragmentized along vertical class divisions rather than merely regional or ethnic lines. Resistance did not vanish after Hastings. Revolts in the north between 1069 and 1071 CE forced William to conduct the devastating campaign later known as the Harrying of the North. Villages were burned. Agricultural infrastructure was annihilated across Yorkshire and surrounding shires. Excavation layers confirm widespread destruction dated precisely to this interval. Grain stores were destroyed. Ploughlands were rendered fallow. The objective was not conquest, but demographic exhaustion. It succeeded. Northern autonomy collapsed permanently. By 1100 CE, the world that had emerged from Saxon migration, consolidation, Christianization, Viking War, and territorial unification no longer existed as a political order. The institutions remained. The ruling class did not. Kingship had passed to a new dynasty. Landholding had been feudalized. Castles dominated the countryside. Ecclesiastical authority aligned with continental reform. The English state persisted as an administrative shell, inhabited by a new social organism. The end of the Saxon world was therefore not a cultural extinction in the demographic sense. The peasantry remained overwhelmingly English. Old English structures survived in law, agriculture, and custom. Yet the political civilization constructed by Saxon kings across 5 centuries, the fusion of territory, law, church, and dynasty, had reached its terminal transformation. Power now rested not on the ancient synthesis of Germanic kingship and Christian institution, but on feudal lordship integrated into a European order of aristocratic domination. What had begun in the marshlands of the North Sea as kin-based migration had become, through successive institutional revolutions, one of the most sophisticated territorial states in early medieval Europe. Its loss in 1066 did not negate that achievement, it absorbed it. The Norman conquest succeeded precisely because the Saxon state had become strong enough to be worth taking whole. The Saxons did not vanish. Their political world did. The English state endured in altered form, carrying within it the deep administrative memory of the civilization that had created it.